When night descended upon the valleys of Wessex, a pale mist would rise from the marshes, curling like breath from some sleeping giant beneath the earth. The villagers whispered that these were the sighs of the old gods, still dreaming in the soil they once ruled. The air carried the scent of damp heather and burning oak, and in the distance, a single bell from a wooden chapel broke the silence, calling the faithful to a faith not yet settled in their bones. Long before the monks carved their Latin prayers into smooth stones, this land belonged to other voices, rough, lyrical, and full of wind. Men gathered around firelight, their faces shadowed by flame and story, their hearts stirred by songs of Woden, of Freya, of things too wild to name. And yet, in the hush between tales, a new sound had begun to spread, the quiet murmur of a cross being raised, a book being opened, a God who spoke of forgiveness rather than thunder. The old and new met not with war, but with a long, uneasy silence, like two tides meeting beneath the moon. On a hill above the river Avon stood an ancient oak, older than the memory of any living soul. Beneath its twisted roots, the ground was soft with centuries of offerings, bones of beasts, shards of iron, coins once bright as sunlit dew. It was said that if one pressed an ear to the bark at dusk, one could still hear faint whispers, a woman's voice perhaps, or the low hum of a forgotten chant. And many had done so, farmers, wanderers, even monks in secret. For though their lips now spoke of Christ, their dreams were still woven with the gods of the mist. There was one such dreamer, a young monk named Edric. He had come from a coastal monastery newly built among the ruins of older stones. He was a man of letters and silence, whose eyes carried the faraway look of someone who had stared too long into candlelight. Edric was troubled by something he could not confess. Each night when he knelt to pray, he saw behind his closed eyes a figure wreathed in smoke, not the Christ he served, but an older shape, antlered and vast, watching him with patient sorrow. He sought the counsel of his abbot, a stern man with a silver beard and weary hands. The abbot listened but said only, "Dreams are snares of the flesh, brother. The old ways die hard, but they die none the less." Yet as the abbot spoke, Edric noticed his own trembling, as if even holy men feared that perhaps the old gods did not die. They merely waited. One storm-laden evening, Edric climbed the hill of the ancient oak, drawn by a whisper that might have been the wind. The mist was so thick it blurred earth from sky. He placed his palm upon the trunk, rough with lichen, and felt warmth, faint like the pulse of a hidden heart. "Who are you?" he murmured. "A memory," came the thought, though no mouth had spoken. "The land remembers what man forgets." His breath caught, and for a moment he felt both terror and tenderness. For what was faith, if not the longing to be seen by something greater? When dawn broke, the mists lifted to reveal the valley below, quiet, ordinary, alive. Yet Edric knew something had changed. He returned to the monastery, his robes damp, his eyes calm. He said nothing of what he'd heard, but when he wrote the next day's prayer, his hand moved slowly, shaping words that no scripture had known. To the one who was before names, who watches through every season, grant peace to the restless. The abbot found the note days later and stared long into it, neither burning it nor praising it. He simply folded it, placed it between the pages of a psalm and whispered, "May he understand." Outside, the fog returned, gentle and unhurried, spreading across the fields like memory itself. The villagers saw it drift over the old stones and said, "The gods are walking again." But others, those who had learned to read, said, "No, it is just the breath of the earth." Perhaps they were both right, for even now when night falls over Wessex and the air turns cold enough to still the heart, One might feel a faint murmur beneath the wind, as if the land itself is whispering an ancient prayer. And somewhere, deep in the soil, the old gods still dream, not with anger, but with the quiet acceptance of those who know they have merely changed their name. And beyond that mist, another story begins to stir, of ships on the horizon, sails white as bone, and a world about to awaken once more. When the tide rolled out across the eastern coast, it left behind not only driftwood and seaweed, but the faint echoes of oars, of men whose faces were salted by wind, and whose speech was braided from the strands of many shores. They were neither fully strangers nor fully kin to the island's old heart. They were seekers. The Engle, the Seax, the Ute, names like gull cries, brief and cutting, carried with them worn shields, bone-handled knives, a few treasured beads, and the warmth of hearth stories folded into their breath. They did not arrive as a single storm, but as a slow weathering of waves upon rock. One curving hull after another, one family after another, one winter deciding the path of the next. On the beaches, the sea spoke in its slow language of foam and hush. Children stepped down first, wide-eyed, clutching their mothers' skirts. Men followed, wary, measuring the line where water kissed earth as if it were a threshold between lives. Behind them, the longboats rested like sleeping fish, bellies of oak dark with spray. Ahead lay a country of broken villas and silent milestones, where Latin letters chipped away under rain and sheep wandered through tiled rooms. Rome's breath still lingered in the mortar, faint as a last candle, but empire had learned the art of disappearing. They made camp where the dunes met the marsh. They raised hide tents, they lit small, careful fires. The night drew close like a blanket. A singer, a scop whose voice had kept many winters alive, lifted a hand and let a low melody thread the dusk. He sang of narrow seas crossed with hope, of ancestors whose names were glints upon a river, of mothers whose laments were also blessings. Words rose, fell, and lingered, and in that listening silence the newcomers felt less like exiles and more like seeds placed deliberately into a furrow. Inland, the land was soft with rivers and reed beds, with fields that remembered plows and the footsteps of vanished legions. They found ruined farmsteads to mend, wells to clean, little gods carved into lintels whose faces had blurred into knots of wood. Here and there, a Briton would stand and watch them with an unreadable gaze. Sometimes there were trade, smiles that held a careful distance. Sometimes there were screams at night and the flash of iron. Was it conquest? The scholars would ask centuries later. Or settlement, or something between. Perhaps the truth is that people arrive not in the neat lines of chronicles, but in the tangled threads of hunger, fear, marriage, and the strange courage to begin again. There is a tale told of a king named Vortigern, of brothers called Hengist and Horsa, of alliances sealed with mead and unsealed with blood. Some say a feast was given and knives rose with the toasts. Others say a bargain was struck that no one truly understood. The fact and the fable braid together like the three strands of a rope. And still, even now, archaeologists kneel in the damp earth and sift beads, potsherds, spearheads, asking the soil to pick a side. It rarely does. The ground, after all, remembers everything and judges nothing. Spring after spring, more keels scratched the shingle. New clearings were opened beside loops of water where willows leaned and whispered. Timber halls rose, not vast but warm, their rafters smoky with stories. Within, benches lined the walls. Dogs slept under tables. The fire pit glowed like a patient heart. And there, while the wind fretted outside, people learned one another anew. A Briton woman with eyes like winter wheat sat beside a Sayax man whose hands were all scars and tenderness. Between them a child drowsed, clutching a wooden toy horse. History, so loud on the battlefield, is often made in these quiet rooms, where a shared bowl passes and a lullaby changes tongue mid-phrase without anyone noticing. Edric, the young monk from the coast, whose dreams still carried antlers and smoke, wandered among these settlements with his abbot's leave, offering words, trading for bread, asking after souls. He carried a thin wooden cross and a book wrapped in leather. When night fell, he would sit near the doorway of a hall and listen, not as a preacher only, but as a man trying to understand the architecture of another heart. He heard the old names, Woden, Thunor, Tew, spoken with affection, with fear, with the kind of respect given to an elder who may be difficult but must still be greeted. He also heard a hunger he knew well, the longing for steadiness, for a hand that does not withdraw, for a light that does not blow out in the wind. One evening, a farmer invited him to bless a new plowed field. The ridges lay dark and damp, like ribs just beneath the skin of the earth. Edric lifted his hand and spoke softly of a maker who sewed stars across the firmament. And beside him, almost without thinking, the farmer murmured another blessing, older than memory, to the spirit of soil and seed. Their voices braided for a breath, and when they fell silent, the land seemed to exhale. 2 prayers for 1 harvest, the farmer said with a tired smile. Edric nodded. Perhaps heaven understands both. Not all meetings were so gentle. In a bend of the river where the reeds grew tall, a small shrine to a forgotten god stood half-collapsed. A band of youths, keen to prove their zeal, toppled what remained and set the fragments upon a heap. Edric found them in the twilight, angry and proud. He asked if the god felt dead now. Of course, they said. He touched the heap's warm stones. Listen. They listened, and heard only frogs, wind, the far rhythm of hooves. What do you hear? One scoffed. Edric smiled sadly. Only the world, which is always holy. The boys left, unsettled. He stayed a while and gathered 3 shards, as one might pick up the pieces of any broken thing, and he set them gently by the path. In those years, the island's languages shook hands and tested one another's weight. Latin retreated into monasteries where quills scratched into night. British tongues held fast in valleys and along western coasts. The speech of the newcomers grew roots, drinking from all it touched, clay, rain, lullaby, oath, and began to leaf into something supple and strong. Words for kin and field, for wolf and winter, words that could carry both tenderness and iron. And though no one knew it, a future poetry already stirred like a fox in the hedgerow. Some nights the sea mourned with storms. A longboat would splinter upon teeth of stone, and the survivors would come ashore clutching one another, coughing water and fragments of prayer. Villagers would gather them in, wrap them in wool, hand them bowls of broth steaming like kindness. The next day, wreckage would glitter along the tide line, a brooch, a broken comb, an iron nail shining like a small star among the bladderwrack. Children would race the gulls to find them. Mothers would braid grief into their hair and then loosen it again because life asks for both. Through it all, the question remained, will new roots kill the old tree or feed it? The abbots and elders argued in low rooms. The warriors argued on open ground. Yet at dusk, when smoke lifted from many roofs and cows moved like slow thoughts through the lanes, one could feel a gentler answer settling into place. People are rivers, not walls. They change course. They pick up silt and stories. They carve new channels around old stones. The island was becoming a confluence. By a fen where the sky often sank into water, Edric met a woman who knew the herbs of every season. She had gathered willow bark and mint. Her basket smelled of cool green things. They spoke of fevers and the way dreams sometimes warn a body before it falls ill. She told him that a child in the village woke speaking words from a tongue he had never learned, a string of sounds like rain on bronze. The elders said it was the old god throwing voice through a small mouth. Edric listened, then asked to meet the child. He found a boy with bright, serious eyes and a habit of glancing at doorways before stepping through them, as if the world itself were a threshold. "What do you hear when you sleep?" Edric asked. The boy whispered, "Footsteps under the floor." The monk shivered. "Perhaps the past is pacing. It tends to until we speak to it kindly." There were nights when Edric could not pray in words. He would walk to the marsh's edge and stand where reeds wrote cursive on the water. The stars made their quiet map. Somewhere in that dark, a curlew called, thin and beautiful. He thought of the antlered shape that once filled his dream and felt neither fear nor betrayal, only the wide ache of a heart learning to hold more than one music. "If truth belongs to heaven," he murmured, "surely heaven is vast." And the wind, which never argues, seemed to agree. You who are listening now, perhaps under your own quiet sky, where do you come from, and what time is it where your night is unfolding? If this gentle journey keeps you company, the crackle of old halls, the hush of fenland, the distant oars, you might leave a small sign for me to find you again, a soft subscription, a lantern left at the door, so we can meet here in future evenings and wander a little farther together. The seasons turned. Barley rose and fell in waves the color of old gold. Calves staggered to their feet and found milk. Lovers glanced and looked away. An elder's chair sat empty one morning, and then forever. In a hall near the coast, a smith hammered a blade, whose edge took on the dusk like a river takes light. He set it down with tenderness, as if laying a child to sleep. "For guarding," he told the woman who waited by the doorway. She nodded, and there was more prayer in that nod than in many sermons. On the far horizon, sails stitched pale crescents against the blue. Not all were friendly, not all were kin. The island, newly woken to its own mingled tongue, would learn again to listen for the turn of fate in the creak of a mast. But for now, for this breath between storms, a lull, cattle low in the meadow, smoke threads heavenward, a child laughs at the miracle of a frog leaping. Edric closes his eyes and opens them again, and the world is still here, steadfast as a hand laid over a racing heart. The tide will return as tides do. New feet will touch this shore as they always have. Some will arrive with songs, others with fury, and many with both stitched together under their ribs. But tonight, beneath a sky large enough to shelter every prayer ever spoken, the fires in the timber halls burn down to coals. A dog sighs, someone hums a tune that does not know whether it is old or new, and out beyond the dunes, oars dip, rise, dip again, carrying the next chapter toward the waiting land. The first light of dawn broke upon the eastern horizon like a slow exhale of gold, spilling over the marshlands, turning dew to flame and mist to pale ribbons drifting between the willows. In that fragile silence before the crows called, before the world remembered to stir, a small village lay breathing beneath the smoke of its own dreams. Huts of wattle and thatch clustered near a winding stream. A single wooden hall stood at the heart, not grand, but proud, its roof crossed by a carved dragon whose wings had been smoothed by rain and years. Inside, warmth clung to the timbers. The smell of peat and mead mingled with the sweetness of bread baked at first light. A scop sat near the hearth, his harp resting against his knee, his voice low and patient as he spoke to no one in particular, and to everyone at once. "There was once a hero," he began, whose name carried through the fog like thunder. But then he smiled, for even the old tales seemed smaller now, as if the island itself was beginning to write new ones, softer ones, not of kings and monsters, but of families and the quiet building of lives. Among those who listened was a boy named Leofric, wide-eyed, curious, the son of a smith. He loved to linger near the old men when they spoke of spirits in the woods and lights that danced above the marsh. His father would often hush him, saying such talk was for those who feared the night, not for those who worked through it. Yet Leofric could never stop wondering. On certain evenings, he would slip away from the hall, following the soft hum of frogs and the ripple of unseen things moving just beyond the edge of sight. There, he would whisper to the air, asking questions no one had ever thought to answer. Not far from that same village, Edric the monk walked once more, older now, though still marked by that calm gaze which saw holiness in both shadow and sun. He carried a satchel of herbs given by the healer woman of the fen, and a small wooden cross he had carved himself. The villagers respected him, though they did not always understand his faith. To them, he was a man who spoke to heaven in the same tone they used to speak to the earth, gentle, patient, without demanding. He spent many nights with the scop, listening to songs older than any parchment could bear. One evening, as the wind moaned softly between the eaves, the scop leaned toward him and asked, "Tell me, holy man, when your God came to this land, did he come as a conqueror?" Edric paused, his eyes on the fire. "No," he said at last, "he came as a whisper. Perhaps that is why he is still heard." The scop nodded slowly, plucking a chord that trembled like rain on still water. "Then maybe," he murmured, "he and our old gods would have understood each other." And outside the night agreed. The mist gathered once again, curling around the trees as though listening too. That same night Leofric dreamt of the sea. In his dream, he stood upon a shore where the waves carried not foam, but voices. They spoke in tongues he did not know, yet somehow understood, fragments of names, of warnings, of farewells. When he awoke, his hair was damp, his heart racing. He told his father, who only shook his head. "Dreams are wind," he said. But Edric, hearing of it, grew thoughtful, for he too had dreamed of the sea, but in his vision the water had been red as rust and the horizon filled with sails. In the weeks that followed, the villagers spoke often of strange lights flickering over the marshes at dusk. Some said it was the spirits of the drowned, others that it was a trick of gas and mist. One evening, when the glow appeared again, Edric walked toward it. The air smelled of salt, though they were far from the coast. As he drew near, he saw the faint outline of a figure, a woman, perhaps, or something that wore her shape. Her hair moved as though underwater, her eyes luminous but kind. "Do you remember us?" she asked in a voice like the hush before thunder. "I remember," he whispered, "but I do not worship." She smiled. "Then you still listen, and that is enough." When the mist cleared, she was gone, and the night lay still once more. In the morning, the villagers found him by the stream, kneeling in the frost, his cross half buried in the earth as though planted. He prayed long, they said. But Edric would not tell what he had seen, only that they should be kind to the land, for it was listening still. Meanwhile, beyond the fields, a quiet tension brewed. Traders brought word of unrest, kingdoms rising and falling like tides. Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, names that once meant tribes now began to sound like crowns. In the south, Alfred of the Golden Mind was learning the art of patience. To the north, warriors murmured in halls lit by the glow of their ambitions. And across the narrow sea, unseen but waiting, the Norsemen sharpened their axes, watching the gulls for signs. But for now, in that small village by the marsh, the people still sang. At dusk, they gathered around the hearth, their voices low, their eyes soft. Leofric listened, his heart half in the song, half in the silence beyond the walls. And sometimes, when the harp fell quiet, he thought he could hear faintly, through the wind, through the crackle of flame, the echo of another music, ancient and slow, as if the island itself were humming its own lullaby. Perhaps it was only imagination, or perhaps it was something else, the voice of a land that never truly forgets those who love it, even when its gods have changed their names. And far to the east, over a restless sea, the first shadow of a sail was beginning to darken the horizon, carrying with it the next storm and the next awakening. The sea has always been a patient storyteller. It waits, it withdraws, it returns. When the waves rose again along the eastern coasts, they carried with them not driftwood nor merchants, but longboats, sleek, hungry shapes cut from oak and destiny. The villagers who woke to their creaking hulls did not at first understand what they saw. The dawn mist clung to the sails, making them seem like pale ghosts gliding through the tide. Yet when the mist parted, there were faces, rough, resolute, their eyes reflecting both hunger and home. The Northmen had come. For weeks before their arrival, omens had whispered. Crows gathered in numbers too great for one harvest. The moon turned red behind the clouds. A mare birthed twin foals, one white, one black, and the old women crossed themselves, though some whispered charms in older tongues. Even the monk Edric, who had learned to find calm in the uncertain, felt an unease curling in his chest. He had dreamed again of antlers rising from the surf, of hands grasping through fog, of a song sung backward. The first village to fall was small, nothing more than a scattering of huts beside the mouth of the river. Smoke rose by midday, curling upward like a plea unanswered. Those who fled spoke of men who fought as if the sea itself guided their arms. They came laughing, one woman said, her voice hollow, not cruelly, as if death was only part of the dance. Edric listened in silence. He had seen such laughter once in his youth, among men who believed they could never be killed. By the time the Northmen reached the marshland villages, word had already spread. Some gathered weapons, others gathered prayers. The Scop's harp lay silent that night, the air heavy with waiting. Leofric, the smith's son, stood beside his father by the forge. The hammer rang again and again, each strike a heartbeat of fear and resolve. "Iron remembers," his father said. "Strike it with faith, and it will hold." Yet neither of them could say what kind of faith they truly meant, in steel, in God, or in the strength of the land itself. When dawn broke, the river bore strange reflections. Longboats slid through the mist like wolves through tall grass. Shields gleamed. The air trembled with the low hum of voices chanting in rhythm with the oars. Edric walked among the villagers, placing a hand on each shoulder he passed, whispering no grand promise of victory, only stand together. When the ships grounded, the water hissed like breath drawn between teeth. What followed was swift and brutal, but not without a strange grace. The Vikings fought as though each blow was a verse of an old song. The Anglo Saxon men, though fewer, met them with the desperate calm of those defending everything they love. Smoke rose, arrows hissed, the cries of the wounded mingled with the roar of waves. And yet, amid that chaos, something remarkable occurred. A young Northman, no older than Leofric, fell wounded near the riverbank. Leofric, driven by impulse or mercy, dragged him from the water's edge and pressed his hand over the bleeding wound. "Why?" the boy gasped. Leofric shook his head. "Because you would have done the same for me." The Northman stared at him, then laughed softly, a sound more sorrow than mirth. "Perhaps we were never meant to be strangers." When the sun sank and the battle's fury ebbed, the survivors gathered what was left of their homes. The Northmen, too, had lost many. Edric walked among the fallen, whispering prayers that knew no borders. He blessed the living and the dead alike, speaking the same words over Saxon and Norseman both. Earth to earth, he murmured, and peace to the restless. In the quiet that followed, strange alliances began to form. The invaders did not leave, they lingered, building shelters beside those they once sought to destroy. Trade replaced theft, shared fire replaced fear. Children of both peoples learned each other's words, first as insults, later as laughter. The land, ever patient, began to weave them together as it had done with so many before. Edric would sometimes walk by the river at dusk, watching the reflection of those twin peoples upon the water. He would think of the old gods and the new, of the voices that still murmured beneath the soil. Perhaps, he whispered once to the wind, peace is not a gift given by heaven, but a memory the earth teaches us to remember. Leofric, now a young man, worked beside his father and the Northmen's smiths, learning how to forge blades that sang when drawn. Blades not for conquest, but for defense, for pride, for craft. Sometimes he would look at the horizon, where the sea lay calm and endless, and wonder what awaited beyond it. The monks recorded those years in ink and prayer, writing of raids, of famine, of faith reborn and trial. Yet what they could not record was the heartbeat beneath, the quiet miracle of coexistence, fragile and trembling, that began to grow like moss over stone. And so the land breathed again. The fires burned low. Children were born who would never remember a time before the mingling of blood and story. The Northmen's songs merged with Saxon hymns, creating melodies that belonged to both and neither. But peace, as always, is a visitor, not a resident. And far to the south, whispers began to stir once more, of kings who dreamed of uniting all the shires under one crown, and of wars not yet written. For now, though, the night was kind. The river whispered softly. The reeds swayed in rhythm, and the stars, old witnesses to every tide of history, blinked gently above. If you are still awake beneath your own quiet sky, tell me, where do you listen from, and what hour of night keeps you company? If this story has found its way to your rest, perhaps leave a small light for me, a soft gesture, a word, a subscription, so that when the next tale begins, our paths may meet again across the hush of time. And somewhere, beyond the river and the sea, a man named Alfred was dreaming, not of peace, but of purpose. In the soft hush before dawn, the air over Wessex hung heavy with the scent of rain and wood smoke. The fields glistened with dew, and somewhere a rooster crowed, a small, defiant sound against the gathering storm of history. In the dim light, a figure rode slowly across the hills, cloaked in gray, his horse's hooves muffled by wet earth. His name was Alfred, though few yet called him the Great. He was not the mighty king of later tales, not yet, but a man worn thin by sleepless nights and restless purpose. The land around him was tired. Smoke still rose from burned villages, and the whispers of the Northmen haunted every road. Yet beneath the fear, there was something unbroken, a pulse, steady and low, like the heartbeat of the island itself. Alfred felt it with each step of his horse. "Wessex endures," he murmured to the wind, as though saying it aloud might make it true. In a nearby monastery, Edric bent over his parchment, copying by lamplight the fading words of the Gospels. His hand trembled, not from age, but from the quiet ache of memory. The battles, the smoke, the faces he had blessed and buried, all lived behind his eyes. Yet even as his ink dried, he believed the same truth Alfred whispered to the hills, that no darkness, however deep, could silence the human will to hope. Outside, a bell tolled, slow, hollow, calling not just monks, but the weary soul of a nation to prayer. Alfred came to Edric that night. He was thinner than a king should be, his cloak stained with travel, his eyes lit by something fierce and fragile. "The Northmen press hard," he said, "the people scatter. But they still look to me, and I wonder if they should." Edric studied him for a long while. "You doubt your crown. I doubt my strength." "Then let the land lend you its own," the monk replied softly. "It has endured longer than kings." They sat together in silence. The candle between them flickered, its flame swaying as if listening. Outside, the rain began, a soft drumming on the roof, steady, forgiving. For days afterward, Alfred remained among the monks. He walked the halls where prayers echoed, read from the Psalms, and listened to the wind through the arches. He spoke little, but his silence carried weight, the kind of silence that listens deeply to the past. He asked about old customs, the songs of the farmers, the ways the pagans once read the sky. He did not despise them. He sought to understand them, believing that to rule men, one must first know what they love, what they fear, what they dream when no one watches. In those days of refuge, Alfred began to write. His quill moved slowly, tracing not commands or treaties, but thoughts, reflections on faith, on wisdom, on the nature of learning itself. "If knowledge perishes," he wrote, "then the light of men dims. Let it not fade from this island." That conviction would later birth his greatest legacy: schools, translations, the rebirth of thought amid ashes. But for now, it was only an idea whispered to parchment under candlelight. Meanwhile, in the village by the marsh, Leofric had become a man. His forge sang each morning, the rhythm of hammer on iron blending with the steady hum of daily life. He had married a woman of mixed blood, her father Saxon, her mother Norse, and together they raised a son whose hair shone like sunlight through smoke. Peace had found them, fragile as frost on spring grass. Yet Leofric often looked westward, wondering how long the calm would last. One evening, travelers brought news. The Northmen had burned Chippenham, and Alfred had fled into the marshes, hunted, half-starved, a king without a kingdom. The village fell silent. Leofric looked toward the fen, remembering the monk who once walked there, and whispered, "May the earth hide him, as it hides all it loves." And indeed, the earth did. Alfred vanished into the wild, into the reeds, the cold, the secrecy of mud and mist. There, he lived as a fugitive, tending fires, watching the stars, speaking softly to the silence that had once frightened him. Legends would later claim he burned the cakes of a peasant woman who sheltered him, too lost in thought to notice the smoke. But perhaps that tale survives because it holds a truth deeper than fact, that even kings must sometimes be humbled to remember what they serve. Weeks passed. The Northmen spread like a storm, claiming towns, rivers, hopes. Yet from the heart of the marshes, a quiet resolve began to rise, a whisper that grew into a song that called the scattered back together. Men came from woods and villages, drawn not by conquest, but by belief that their home, their tongue, their faith still mattered. And at their center stood Alfred, no longer fleeing, but listening, to them, to the wind, to something older still. Edric found him there one evening, kneeling in the mud beside a small fire. "So," the monk said softly, "the tide returns." Alfred smiled faintly. Or perhaps it was never gone, only waiting. They spoke no more that night. The reeds whispered, and the fire crackled. Above them the stars burned patiently, ancient witnesses to the birth of courage. From that hidden heart of Wessex, hope spread outward. Villages stirred, forges lit again. The hush before dawn grew heavy with purpose. The land, scarred, silent, steadfast, seemed to breathe in unison with its people once more. If you're still here, listening through the quiet hours, tell me, where does your night find you? Is the rain falling where you are, as it did that night in the marshes? If this story keeps you company, let your presence be known, a whisper in the dark, a small light left glowing, so that when the next tale unfolds, we'll find each other again among the embers of history. And beyond the mist and the river reeds, Alfred's gaze turned northward, toward a dawn not yet certain, but waiting to be claimed. The dawn came pale and hesitant, brushing its first silver breath across the marshlands where Alfred's camp lay hidden. Smoke curled from small fires, carrying the scent of damp reed and broth. The men stirred slowly, weary, hollow-eyed, but alive. For months they had lived like ghosts, their kingdom swallowed by the sea of invasion. Yet in their silence, something had begun to change. Fear had settled into focus. Loss had ripened into resolve. Alfred rose before the others, his cloak heavy with dew. He watched the horizon, the faint shimmer of water, the distant line of the woods, and listened. The land was quiet, but not empty. Somewhere beneath the soil and the mist, he could almost feel the pulse of the island, slow and patient, as though waiting for him to remember its rhythm.
"Edric," he murmured, and the monk appeared beside him, calm as always. The lines around his eyes deeper now, but not unkind. "You should rest," said Edric. "There will be time to rest when Wessex is free." "Or never," the monk replied gently. "Even kings must learn the mercy of sleep."
Alfred smiled faintly. Sleep? No. I dream instead of a land unbroken, of a people who know themselves. He looked toward the east where the fog was thinning. If we are to endure, it will not be through the sword alone. We must remember who we are and why. That day, Alfred called his followers together, farmers, monks, smiths, men whose only armor was will. He stood upon a small rise, the wind tugging at his cloak, and spoke not as a king, but as one among them. "They think us scattered," he said, "but they do not know the strength of roots. The storm may break our branches, yet the earth still holds us fast." The men listened, still and intent. Even the reeds seemed to hush. And as his words took hold, something unseen yet powerful moved among them, a quiet unity, a shared breath. Hope, once a fragile ember, flared into flame.
When night fell, they sang, not songs of victory or blood, but old tunes, the kind sung by hearthsides, by mothers, by men remembering gentler days. The notes drifted through the dark like soft lanterns. The marsh heard them, the stars heard them, and perhaps, somewhere beyond both, the gods of the old and new paused to listen too.
Leofric was among those who came to join him. He brought his hammer and his heart, both tempered by loss. "I've forged blades for others," he told Alfred, "but I would forge one for you. One born not of conquest, but of endurance." Alfred clasped his shoulder. "Then let it be sharp enough to cut despair itself."
By the next moon, the forge in the marsh rang with purpose. Leofric's hammer fell steady as prayer. Sparks bloomed like stars reborn in the darkness. The men gathered to watch, their faces lit by the glow, each strike echoing the pulse of the land itself. When the blade was finished, it gleamed faintly blue beneath the torchlight, not with arrogance, but quiet strength. "Its name?" asked Edric. Alfred traced a finger along its edge. "Aethelstan," he said softly, "noble stone, for we are all stones in this foundation."
Word of Alfred's survival spread like dawn through the mists. Villagers who had hidden their faith in silence began to return. Messengers came from the downs and the valleys, whispering of a gathering, an army forming not from pride, but from the stubborn refusal to vanish. The Northmen, who thought the land subdued, began to sense the shifting beneath their feet, the murmur of rebellion, the rustle of men awakening. One evening, Edric sat with Alfred by the fire. Between them, the flames danced like tongues of time itself. "You've spoken often of rebuilding," said the monk. "But tell me, my king, what would you build first?" Alfred stared into the embers. "A school," he said at last, "a place where words outlast swords. For if our children can read the stories of their fathers, no conqueror can truly rule them." Edric nodded slowly. "Then perhaps that is the truest victory." Silence settled again, not heavy, but full, alive with the sound of the night. Crickets, wind, the soft dripping of water from the reeds. The world, for a moment, seemed at peace, and somewhere far away, in the halls of the Northmen, a warlord named Guthrum turned in his sleep and dreamed of fire on the marsh. Not destruction, but light, spreading, growing, unstoppable. If you are listening beneath your own midnight sky, tell me, does the wind outside your window carry a calm or a storm yet to come? Whether it is dawn where you are or deep night, let this story rest beside you for a while. And if you've walked with me through this mist and fire, leave a small sign, a word, a touch, a quiet subscription, so that when the tale turns again, we may find each other by its glow. For soon the hidden fire of Wessex would rise, and the tide that once drowned it would begin to retreat. The morning that followed was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The mist had rolled back to the low valleys, revealing fields damp with dew and a pale sun just breaking through the gray. Alfred stood at the edge of the marsh, his cloak heavy with moisture, watching the horizon where the world seemed to hold its breath. Behind him, men stirred, mending weapons, sharpening blades, whispering prayers both old and new. The air carried the scent of wet earth and something else, the faint, metallic promise of change. It had been months since Alfred fled into these swamps, months of hiding, planning, enduring hunger and the weight of uncertainty. Yet here, among reeds and mud and the stubborn pulse of the land, he had found something no crown could give him: understanding. A kingdom was not built from walls or thrones, but from hearts that remembered who they were. By the firelight of the previous night, Alfred had spoken to Edric one last time before dawn. "When I rise," he said, "I must rise not as the hunted, but as the shepherd. Wessex is scattered, yet every man who still calls this soil home is a thread. I will gather them, and when the loom turns, we will weave again." The monk nodded, his eyes reflecting both pride and foreboding. "Then your hour is near. The land listens when courage speaks." That day, Alfred's riders moved like shadows through the countryside, carrying word of gathering, of return, of hope. Men left their plows half buried in the furrows. Blacksmiths laid down hammers mid-stroke. Monks closed their books and blessed the road. From forest, hill, and village they came, not a great army by number, but bound by something stronger than steel. Leofric marched among them, the sword he had forged gleaming faintly beneath the clouded light. His wife stood at the edge of the road, their child in her arms. "Come back to us," she whispered. "I will," he said softly. "But even if I fall, and he touched his son's small hand, will grow in a land that remembers." When they reached Alfred's camp, the men gathered in a circle, their faces drawn but steadfast. The king stood before them, not upon a dais, not armored in gold, but clothed in the same mud and weariness as they. "The Danes think us broken," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "They see our villages burned and our crosses cast down, but they do not see the roots beneath the ash. For every hall they've razed, 100 hearts have kindled fire in secret. And now the roots speak." A murmur rippled through the ranks, not of fear, but of awakening. They moved at dusk. The marsh swallowed their footfalls. The sky deepened to the color of old bronze. The men carried torches covered with cloth to hide their light, and the silence between them was sacred. They crossed rivers, glided through woods, marched across ridges that once held Roman roads. Each mile was a heartbeat, each breath a vow. When they reached the plain of Eddington, dawn broke like revelation. The Danish banners were already there, dragons of red and black whipping against the wind. Guthrum's host stood arrayed, vast and sure, their shields locked, their laughter loud. They believed the island was already theirs. But Alfred, standing before his men, lifted his blade, the one Leofric had forged in the marsh, and it caught the light of the morning sun. "For the land," he said softly, "for all that endures." The battle that followed would be told in many tongues, in chronicles, in songs, in whispers by the hearth. Swords clashed, shields splintered, cries rose and fell like waves. Alfred fought not from rage but from resolve, moving through the chaos like a man guided by memory itself. Leofric was at his side, his hammer swung blows ringing like thunder. Edric, unarmed, walked among the wounded, his robes stained dark, his prayers unbroken. The tide turned by noon. The Danes faltered, not for lack of strength, but because they met something they could not name. Not vengeance, not hatred, but a people who refused to forget themselves. When it was over, the field was still. The crows circled. The wind carried the smell of sweat, earth, and iron. Alfred knelt, pressing his hand to the soil. "Not mine," he whispered. "Ours." Guthrum was captured, but Alfred spared him. He offered peace, baptism, and a kingdom shared in faith, not burned in pride. The Northmen, weary and astonished, accepted. The rivers would run with new names, but no longer with blood. In the weeks that followed, Wessex breathed again. The fields were sown, the forges rekindled. The bells rung, not for mourning, but for mourning. Leofric returned home with his hands scarred and his eyes older. His wife met him by the threshold, their child running barefoot through the grass. "It's over?" she asked. "For now," he said. "But peace must be tended, like fire." Edric spent his final years near Winchester, teaching children to write, not scripture only, but stories. For memory, he would tell them, is the truest kingdom. And Alfred, the once fugitive king, walked often at twilight along the meadows, alone, his crown left behind on the table of his hall. He would listen to the hum of crickets, to the laughter from distant cottages, to the steady breath of a land healed but not forgotten. Sometimes he spoke to the night. "We endured," he would say quietly. "May those who come after us do the same." And far away, in the deep woods where fog still lingered, the old oak stood as it always had, its roots wrapped around the bones of forgotten altars, its leaves whispering both Christian prayers and pagan songs. If one listened closely, between wind and memory, one could almost hear the voices of the old gods and the new, not in battle, but in accord. And so the island slept, dreaming of what it had been and what it was yet to become. Years passed as softly as the turning of pages in a forgotten book. The wounds of war healed beneath the rhythm of rain and harvest, and the kingdom that once hid in marshes now stood proud beneath the wide, forgiving sky. Alfred's dream, born in exile and nurtured in mud, began to take root in stone, in words, in hearts. The monasteries he rebuilt hummed again with learning. The bells of Wessex rang not for alarm, but for prayer, for teaching, for life. In the quiet courtyards of Winchester, children bent over wax tablets, tracing letters that had once been known only to monks. The Latin words of the old empire met the soft curves of the English tongue, two rivers mingling, shaping the sound of a nation still learning its name. Edric's former pupils now taught others, and the stories he once told of gods and men, of fire and forgiveness, lived on in the lips of those who had never met him. Leofric, now older and slower, still worked the forge, though his hammer fell with gentler rhythm. His son, grown tall and steady-handed, had taken much of the work himself. On some evenings the two stood side by side in the orange glow, not speaking, the silence between them filled with understanding. The blade forged in the marsh hung above the hearth, no longer a weapon, but a symbol, polished by time and reverence. Sometimes, in the stillness of dusk, Leofric's wife would hum an old tune, half lullaby, half hymn, and he would close his eyes, remembering. The faces of those who had not returned from Eddington came and went like flickers of candlelight. "They're part of us still," he'd murmur. "Every breath we take is a prayer they once began." But even in peace, the air of the island carried restlessness. The Northmen, though quiet, remained, settled in their new towns, trading, marrying, carving runes beside church doors. And though there was peace between them and the Saxons, the wind sometimes carried faint traces of tension, like the memory of a storm that had not quite finished. In the great hall of Winchester, King Alfred sat by the hearth one winter evening, a parchment open before him. The candlelight played upon his tired face. Around him lay maps, books, and the quiet weight of unfinished dreams. A young scholar entered, timid, reverent, and bowed. "Your Majesty, the scribes ask what you would have them translate next. The Psalms, or perhaps the histories?" Alfred looked up, his gaze distant. "Neither," he said softly. "Not yet. Tell them to write the laws of mercy. Let every man learn not only what is forbidden, but what is good." The young man bowed again, but hesitated. "Sire, some say such mercy will make us weak." Alfred smiled faintly, the lines around his mouth deepening. "Then let them learn that mercy is the truest strength. The sword may win a kingdom, but kindness keeps it." He rose, walking toward the open window. Outside, the night stretched vast and cold, scattered with stars. The wind carried faint laughter from the courtyard below. Children at play, long past curfew. "Listen to that," Alfred whispered. "That is the sound of peace, and peace must always be taught anew." The years that followed were golden in memory, though they were never easy. Famine came and went, and new kings were crowned beyond the borders of Wessex. But within the heart of the land, the pulse of learning and faith endured. Monks copied books by candlelight, bards sang of courage and loss, farmers marked their fields with small wooden crosses, praying for rain, for patience, for grace. Leofric's son married a girl from a northern town, her father a Dane, her mother Saxon. Their wedding feast was a chorus of two tongues, laughter braided with new beginnings. Edric's name was spoken like a blessing at the meal's end, though none there had seen his face in years. And on a hill overlooking the town, Alfred built a small stone chapel, not for grandeur, but for remembrance. Its walls were rough, its altar simple, its air fragrant with wax and earth. "So that," he said, "when the storms return, as they always do, our children will have a place to remember why we endured." One evening, as the sun bled gold across the downs, Alfred stood before that chapel alone. His beard was silver now, his hands slower, his breath marked by age. Yet his eyes, always bright, always searching, still carried the same quiet fire that had burned in the marshes long ago. He knelt and whispered, "Lord, let this light outlast me." Far below, in the village, Leofric's grandson was born that very night, his first cry rising into the same wind that carried Alfred's prayer. And perhaps, somewhere between heaven and earth, the two voices met, one ending, one beginning, and the island, listening as always, smiled in its sleep. "If you are still with me beneath your own ceiling of stars, where does your night find you now? Is the air cool where you are, or heavy with the hum of life still stirring? Leave me a whisper of your world, a word, a moment, a soft sign, so that when the story drifts on, I'll know which hearts still travel beside it. For soon the hand of time will turn again, and the peace of Wessex will face its next shadow. The seasons turned again, as they always do, quiet revolutions written in the soft language of wind and leaf. The golden years of Alfred's peace began to thin at their edges, like old parchment held too long by trembling hands. The king's strength waned, though his spirit did not. The ink on his laws had dried, yet their echo still lived in the voices of men who quoted him in fields, in courts, in whispered fireside talk. Winchester, once a fragile heart beating beneath fear, had grown into a living memory of resilience. The streets bustled with merchants speaking in mingled tongues, Saxon, Norse, Latin, a song of many notes. Children with pale hair and dark eyes played together without knowing which ancestor had been conqueror and which conquered. The land, at last, had learned to breathe in harmony. And yet, even in peace, history has its restless pulse. Far to the north, rumors drifted down with the cold winds, whispers of kings who dreamed too wide, of swords that longed for the taste of glory again. It was not the Danes this time, but ambition itself that stirred in the shadows. Alfred, in his final winters, spent long hours beside the hearth, quill in hand, writing thoughts that would never find an audience in his lifetime. The strength of a kingdom, he wrote, is not in its walls or its gold, but in the memory of its people. Forgetfulness is the first invasion. He closed the book, his hand trembling, and smiled faintly at the irony that he himself was beginning to forget small things, a name, a word, a reason for a scar. Leofric came to see him once more, gray now and slower in step, his forge work left to his son. When he entered the royal chamber, Alfred greeted him not as a king, but as a friend of old battles. "You forged my sword," he said, his voice low but warm. "And in doing so, you forged my will." Leofric bowed his head. "No, my lord, the fire was already in you. I only gave it a shape." The two men sat together long into the evening, speaking of neither victory nor sorrow, only of the land, of the smell of wet earth after rain, of the sound of sheep moving like pale ghosts across the downs, of the quiet weight of peace, so easily taken for granted. As the fire burned low, Alfred turned to the window, where a soft moon watched over Winchester. "When I am gone," he said, "tell them I tried to build something that would outlive both war and prayer." "You have," Leofric answered. "You've built memory." The king smiled, then closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in listening. For even now he could hear it, the murmur of the island, steady and ancient, the same breath that had carried him from the marshes to the throne. In the months that followed, Alfred's illness deepened. He no longer rode the hills or walked the cloisters. Yet each morning, a monk would read aloud the chronicles of his reign, and each morning, Alfred would stop him midway to ask, "Do they speak of the people? Do they tell their names?" The monk would nod, though sometimes he wept when he said it. When spring returned, bringing the scent of blossom to the riverbanks, the king's time drew near. On his final night, he asked to be carried outside. They laid him upon a simple chair in the garden of the monastery. The stars opened above him, vast and still, like the pages of an unwritten book. Edric's successor, a gentle monk named Oswin, stood by his side. "Is there anything more you wish to say, my king?" Alfred's lips curved into a tired smile. "Only this. Tell them that every dawn carries the same choice, to build or to destroy. And may they always choose the harder path, the one that builds." He closed his eyes and his breath slipped from him like mist dissolving into morning. They buried him at Winchester, not in gold or marble, but beneath simple stone, one marked only with a cross and a line that read, "He who remembered when others forgot." The bells tolled, not in mourning, but in gratitude, and across the fields of Wessex the wind moved gently, as though carrying his last words to every corner of the land. Leofric returned home to his forge, now tended by his son. He placed his hammer on the wall and whispered, "It is finished." That night he dreamed of Alfred, young again, walking through fields of sunlight, the marsh mist gone at last. In the village, people began to tell stories of the king who hid among them, who rose from the mud to lead them home. The tales grew softer, blurred by time, but the heart of them remained. And in the telling, something sacred endured. If you are still here beneath your own quiet night, do you hear it too? That faint rhythm beneath the hum of the world, the pulse of things that never truly end. If this story keeps you company as the stars drift by, let me know you're still listening. Perhaps with a word, a breath, a whisper of light left behind. For though one king's story closes, the island is far from sleep. Beyond the horizon, new names are already stirring. Men and women who will take the language Alfred saved and shape it into song. And the mist, eternal as memory, waits patiently to rise again. The years after Alfred's passing flowed gently, like a river that had learned to move without fury. His son, Edward, took the throne, cautious, thoughtful, carrying the quiet dignity of a man raised in the echo of greatness. Yet even he would sometimes walk through the old marshes where his father once hid, feeling the whisper of reeds against his hands, the damp earth breathing beneath his feet. "Here," he would murmur, "is where courage is born, not in courts, but in silence."
Under Edward's reign, the peace Alfred had carved with words and will continued to stretch its fragile wings. The monasteries thrived. Traders crossed from Francia and Frisia. The clink of coin mixed with the laughter of children learning to read in both Saxon and Latin. The island, for a time, seemed to remember how to rest. But peace, as the old monk Oswin often said, is like a candle. It does not fight the dark, it simply endures it. And in that endurance lies both beauty and danger.
One winter evening, as the first frost silvered the fields, Leofric's forge still glowed in the fading light. He was old now, his beard white as ash, his hands stiff with the memory of years. His son, Alaric, worked beside him, strong, deliberate, humming the same tune Leofric once heard from his wife's lips long ago. Above the hearth hung the sword forged for Alfred, gleaming faintly in the firelight, its surface etched by time but unbroken.
Leofric often spoke to his grandchildren of the days of the marsh, of the king who rose from despair. "Remember," he would tell them, "a nation is not built by victory, but by those who refuse to forget." The children would listen wide-eyed, their faces soft in the glow, and sometimes, just sometimes, the fire would flicker as if the memory itself leaned closer to listen. In Winchester, the monks copied and sang. Oswin, now frail but bright-eyed, kept Edric's teachings alive. He began to compile the words of those who came before, fragments of stories, prayers, and folk songs that had wandered through centuries without a home. "Let no word be lost," he would whisper to his scribes, "for every word is a seed, and the earth remembers where they fall." Among the scrolls and codices, he found something strange, an older parchment, its ink faded but clear enough to read. It was signed simply, Edric, and written in that familiar hand were words that made him pause. "The gods may sleep, and kings may fade, but the land remembers all who listen. Each root, each river, each whisper of wind is the scripture no hand has written. When the world forgets its faith, the earth will remind it, softly, through us." Oswin read it aloud that evening as the candles burned low, and those who heard it felt something stir, not fear, but wonder. For perhaps holiness was not bound to heaven alone, but woven into the very soil beneath their feet. By the turn of the decade, England had begun to take shape. Still fragile,
still dreaming, but breathing as one body. The Northmen who once raided now traded in markets alongside Saxon farmers. Marriages joined what swords had once divided. The children born of those unions spoke a tongue no one before them had spoken. Rough yet melodic, strong yet full of grace. It was the birth of a language that would one day carry poems and prayers to the farthest edges of time. And yet, amid that quiet progress, the land still kept its mysteries. On moonless nights, travelers claimed to see pale lights moving among the barrows and voices singing in no known speech. Some said it was the old gods remembering their names. Others said it was the restless dreams of those who had built the first fires of England. The monks smiled at such talk, but even they left candles burning in the windows, just in case. One night, as the wind rose and the stars vanished behind the clouds, Leofric woke suddenly. The forge was cold, the world hushed. In the dark, he thought he heard the faint ringing of metal, a single, pure note, like a hammer striking once upon an unseen anvil. He rose, his breath misting in the chill, and looked toward the hearth. The sword of Alfred shimmered faintly, though no light touched it. He smiled then, slow, peaceful, and whispered, "Still you guard us, old friend." He sat by the fire until dawn, eyes half closed, hands folded like a man in prayer. And when the morning came, the house was filled with stillness. Alaric found him there, seated as though merely resting, the faintest smile upon his lips. They buried him near the forge, beneath a simple oak that had grown strong beside his workshop. The sword he left to his son, and with it a single line carved into the wooden beam above the door. "We are all smiths of memory." Years later, when travelers came through that village and heard the steady rhythm of Alaric's hammer, they would sometimes pause, feeling as though the sound carried something more, a heartbeat, an echo, a promise. And far away, in the cloisters of Winchester, Oswin finished his great work. The final page of his book bore no scripture, only these words: "And the island slept, not in forgetfulness, but in dreaming." If you are still awake beneath whatever sky shelters you tonight, know that the same wind that once touched those meadows still moves through your world. The same patience, the same longing, the same hope. Let it carry you gently toward rest. And if this story has been a quiet companion to your evening, leave a trace of your presence, a breath, a word, a whisper in the dark, so that when the next chapter unfolds, I will know you are still here, walking beside history's dream. For even in peace, the past does not end. It only waits, just beyond the mist. The years folded softly into decades, and the old kingdom began to dream of itself anew. Time, like the tide, reshaped the shores of memory, smoothing rough edges, carrying whispers farther than men's feet could walk. Wessex no longer stood alone. It was now part of a land that called itself England, though the word still trembled like a young branch in spring wind. The villages had grown into towns, the markets into voices of many tongues, Saxon and Dane, Briton and stranger. And yet, beneath all this movement, the quiet soul of the island endured. The same pulse that had murmured beneath marsh and oak, beneath altar and anvil. In the monastery of Winchester, Oswin had long since passed into legend. His book, The Memory of the Land, sat upon a wooden shelf, worn by candle soot and years of prayer. Few who opened it now could read his careful hand, but they traced the ink nonetheless, as if touching the ghost of his thoughts might awaken something within their own hearts. Outside those cloisters, the children of Leofric's line still worked iron. Alaric's son, now a man grown with eyes like river stone, had taken his craft further than his forefathers. His forge stood on the edge of the village where the hill began to rise, close enough for travelers to find, but far enough that the ringing of his hammer echoed freely into the open air. People said that when he worked, the very birds quieted. as though the sound itself was a kind of prayer.
He called himself Cuthred, and he had little patience for talk of kings or saints. Yet, when the wind was right, he would hum the songs his grandfather once hummed, the old hymns that carried both heaven and earth in their rhythm. On certain nights, when the sky was particularly clear, he would set down his hammer and walk the fields where Alfred's soldiers once gathered, running his fingers through the grass. "All gone," he would whisper, "yet still here."
It was during one such walk that he found the stranger, a tall man in a travel-worn cloak, sitting by a stream and mending a broken blade. The stranger's hair was silver, though his back was straight and his eyes sharp as frost. "You mend it well," Cuthred said quietly, "but some steel remembers its breaking." The man smiled without looking up. "And some hearts remember their forging." He turned the blade toward the light, testing its edge. "This sword belonged to a monk once, or so the trader told me. Strange, isn't it, how faith and iron find each other?" Cuthred studied him. "Few monks wield swords." "Few kings begin in mud," the stranger answered. A silence stretched between them, deep as the river itself. Then the man sheathed the blade and rose, his movements slow but steady. "Tell me," he asked, "does this land still remember what it was?" Cuthred hesitated. "We remember in stories and in silence." The man nodded, satisfied. "Good. That's enough." He left before dusk, heading north toward the old Roman road, his figure swallowed by the light. Only later did Cuthred notice what remained by the stream, a scrap of parchment, damp but legible, marked with a hand that trembled yet spoke clearly. "The island never forgets. It only teaches in whispers." Cuthred kept the note folded in a small box beside his tools. He did not show it to anyone, though sometimes, on stormy nights, he would take it out and read it by the forge's glow, feeling as though someone, somewhere, had written it for him alone. In the years that followed, his own children grew, and with them the world. Kings rose, borders blurred, tongues changed shape. The stories of Alfred became softer, more distant, wrapped in legend, yet his name, spoken even quietly, still carried warmth. People no longer feared the Northmen. They traded stories of shared ancestors instead. The sword that had once gleamed in the marsh now lay in a monastery chest, its edge dulled but its meaning sharper than ever. And the oak, that ancient watcher by the river, still stood. Seasons stripped and clothed it again, birds nested in its hollows, and sometimes, when the night was particularly still, travelers claimed they heard faint voices beneath its boughs, one speaking Latin, one in the tongue of the Saxons, one older still, all blending into a single breath of peace. If you are listening now beneath the hum of your own quiet world, you may feel that same breath, the echo of centuries folded into the pulse beneath your ribs. The same patience that watched over kings and smiths, monks and dreamers, now watches you. So, before sleep takes you, listen closely to your silence. It speaks the same language they once did, and if the night is kind, perhaps it will carry your name too, softly, into that same eternal mist where history, memory, and dream are one. For beyond that mist, another dawn waits, and the island will awaken once more. The centuries moved quietly, their passing marked not by thunder, but by the slow drift of habit and hope. The kingdom Alfred had once dreamed into being became a country in name, and that name, England, settled upon the tongue like something both fragile and inevitable. The rivers still wound their ancient paths, carrying reflections of clouds and memory, and the forests murmured with voices that no longer spoke in words, but in wind. In the little forge by the hill, Cuthred had grown gray. The fire that once leapt eagerly at his touch now burned low, content. His children had taken his place at the anvil, their laughter ringing over the steady rhythm of work. And though his body had grown frail, his eyes were still clear. bright with that quiet wonder shared by all who know that they are part of something older than themselves.
On most evenings, when the day's light faded and the scent of iron gave way to smoke and bread, he would sit at the doorway, watching the valley. The world, it seemed, had grown gentler, though it was a different kind of gentleness than before. The old gods had faded fully into story, and the cross stood firm upon every hill. Yet Cuthred sometimes thought the two were not enemies, only different languages for the same reverence. He once said to his daughter, as they watched a thunderstorm roll across the plains, "The sky has never chosen sides. It only listens."
Not far from their village, at the monastery where Alfred and Edric had once walked, young novices continued to copy the same lines of scripture that had guided their fathers and their fathers before them. But between those words, in the blank margins, in the spaces of thought between prayers, they sometimes added small verses of their own. Simple things, notes about the weather, sketches of birds, fragments of local legends. One of them, written in a hand unsure yet graceful, read, "Tonight the rain falls softly, like the breath of the earth remembering itself. The old oak still stands. I think the saints would not mind if we prayed to it a little." Perhaps the saints didn't, for in those years England was not yet an empire, nor even a certainty. Just a shared dream held together by stories, by faith, by the steady rhythm of daily life.
Cuthred's eldest son, Wystan, was a man of gentle mind and strong shoulders. He spent his days smithing, but at night he carved small figures from leftover wood, faces of saints, birds in flight, sometimes even antlered men who belonged more to whisper than to scripture. His wife teased him gently for it. "The old ways still call to you?" she'd say. He'd smile. "No, but they remember me kindly." One evening, a traveler stopped by their home, a woman cloaked in dark wool, carrying a satchel of worn papers. Her accent was strange, her eyes sharp with thought. She asked if she might rest by the fire, and as they shared bread and warmth, she spoke of her journey. "I collect stories," she said. "Not those of kings or wars, but of people, of the ones history forgets." Cuthred, listening from his chair, smiled faintly. "Then you've come to the right land. We have more memory than map."
The woman nodded. "So they say. Every mile here feels as if someone is walking beside me, unseen but near." Later that night, when the others had gone to sleep, she took out her papers and wrote by the glow of the hearth. Her quill moved slowly, almost reverently. On the page, she wrote, "The descendants of those who stood at Eddington still shape the earth with their hands. They do not call it history, only life. But in their silence, one can hear the song of the past, faint as a heartbeat, patient as dawn." In the morning, she was gone, leaving behind only a single folded page tucked into Cuthred's wooden box. The same box that held the old parchment once left by the silver-haired stranger. He never read it aloud, but sometimes, when the wind turned east, he'd open it and let the scent of the paper drift into the air, as if releasing a prayer. Years passed, as they always do. Wystan's children grew and moved beyond the valley. The forge changed hands again. The oak by the river grew wider, its roots reaching deeper into the bones of the earth. And one winter morning, when frost glittered like silver on the branches, the villagers found Cuthred's chair empty. Only his cloak remained, folded neatly, and the faint sound of a hammer striking somewhere in the wind. They said he'd gone to join his ancestors, that perhaps the land, remembering his devotion, had finally called him home. Some swore that on certain nights, if one walked near the forge at moonrise, they could still hear the echo of his song, a soft rhythm of iron and heart. And so the island dreamed on, its people moving forward, its roots holding fast. The world beyond would change. Kings would rise and fall, empires would come and go. But deep beneath the soil, under the oak and the stone, England, that quiet, enduring thought of a land once forged in faith and fog, would go on breathing. If you're still awake, listening to the faint hum of your own night, feel that breath. It's older than the stars outside your window. And if this story has walked beside you through the hours, leave a sign of your presence, a soft word, a quiet thought, a moment of stillness, so that when the next chapter stirs from the mist, I'll know you are still here, keeping watch beside history's sleeping heart. For even as the years drift into shadow, the island remembers, always. The centuries that followed came dressed in new sounds, the clang of coins, the tolling of bells, the murmur of foreign traders along the wharves of growing towns. Yet beneath it all, the land still carried its old voice, soft and low, breathing through every field and forest. England had begun to weave itself into something larger, not merely a kingdom of kings, but of memory, craft, and faith stitched quietly together. The line of Leofric's kin had spread across the valleys. Some became smiths, as he once was. Others turned to the church or the quill. But in each of them, the same quiet strength lingered, the sense that to work the land, to write, to mend, was to speak the ancient language of the island itself. Among them was a girl named Elfwin. She had her great-grandfather's patience and her mother's fire, her eyes the color of wet stone beneath rain. From a young age, she preferred the company of wind and water to that of people. She listened to the river as if it might tell her things the world had forgotten. And sometimes, perhaps, it did. She grew up in the village that had once held Cuthred's forge. By her time, the forge had long fallen quiet, its stones wrapped in ivy and moss. But one winter evening, while wandering near the riverbank, she found a half-buried shape beneath the frost, a piece of metal, dark and heavy, curved like the wing of a bird. She brought it home, cleaned it, and found the faint tracing of a line, a mark shaped like an A, worn nearly smooth. When she showed it to her grandfather, he stared for a long moment before whispering, "Alfred." That night by firelight, he told her the story of the king who once rose from the marshes, of the sword forged in faith, of the men who carried it through rain and battle. His voice trembled not from age but from awe. They say the sword was lost after the king's passing. Perhaps it did not wish to be kept. Perhaps it wished to rest. Elfwin ran her thumb along the relic's edge. Then why did it rise again?
Her grandfather smiled softly. Because memory never truly sleeps.
She placed the piece upon her window ledge, and in the days that followed, sunlight touched it each morning, gleaming faintly, as if remembering. She began to dream strange dreams. In one, she walked across a field of mist, the air thick with the scent of salt and iron. Figures moved beside her, shadows of men and women, their faces kind and calm. One of them turned, and she thought she saw eyes like the reflection of water, bright and knowing. When she woke, the wind outside was whispering through the eaves, almost speaking her name. By then, the land had changed much. Stone churches rose where wooden ones had stood. Roads stretched like veins between towns. The tongue of the people had softened and blended, carrying the traces of every soul who had ever called the island home. And though Elfwin lived in peace, she often felt the hum of something beneath it, as though history itself still walked beside her, unseen but near. One evening, while tending the hearth, she opened the small box that her family had kept for generations, the one said to hold the old parchments. Inside were 3 folded leaves, browned by age. The first bore Edric's words, "The land remembers what man forgets." The second, Oswin's, "Every word is a seed." And the third, the note found by Cuthred, left by the stranger, "The island never forgets. It only teaches in whispers. She held them over the light, her heart quickening. 3 voices, she murmured, 3 keepers. In that moment, she understood what her forefathers had tried to tell her, that history was not a story written once and finished, but a song always returning to its first note. She felt herself become part of it, not by name, but by listening. That spring she rebuilt the forge, not for war, not for kings, but for memory. She shaped small things, tools, rings, iron leaves that caught the sun in their curved edges. And every time her hammer fell, it seemed the sound carried something of the past, as if the earth itself was keeping time with her.
Travelers passing through the valley would often stop, drawn by the ringing. Some said it reminded them of church bells, others of the sea. One old monk, visiting from the north, stood by her door and whispered, "The sound of the world remembering itself."
Elfwin smiled. Then let it remember a little longer. That night, as twilight brushed the hills, she stood outside the forge, the wind cool upon her face. The stars were faint, the sky deep and tender. From the distance came the cry of an owl, ancient, familiar. She closed her eyes and listened. Somewhere beyond hearing, perhaps beneath the roots of the old oak, the island stirred, not awake, not asleep, but dreaming still. Dreaming of those who had walked its fields, who had prayed and fought and built and sung. Dreaming of every heartbeat that had joined its own. If you are still awake beneath the same stars, for they are the same, though ages apart, you are part of that dream too. Your breath joins the chorus of the earth. Your silence is another verse in its endless song.
So rest now, and let the island's memory cradle you, as it did them. For the mist is rising again, and beyond it a new dawn waits, one that carries both the past and what is yet to come.
By the time another century had ripened and fallen, the world had taken on a different shape. Towns had swollen into small cities, and spires of stone now caught the light where once there had only been trees and mist. Yet for all the new walls and roads, the island's pulse beat on in quiet constancy beneath them, soft and patient, like the rhythm of a deep and ancient sleep. Elfwin's forge had long outlived her, though her name still lingered on the tongues of those who walk the valley. The forge itself was now part of a larger hall, a place where apprentices came from distant shires to learn the craft she had revived. Over the doorway, someone had carved her words, "Let the land remember through our hands." Inside that hall, on a cold morning when the fog pressed low over the hills, a young apprentice named Edwin wiped the soot from his brow and turned toward the hearth. He was 16, perhaps, though his eyes carried the same kind of quiet thoughtfulness that had lived in those who came before him. The old master, who had taught him to listen to the iron as much as to strike it, often said, "The fire answers truth. It knows when you are certain, and it knows when you lie." That morning, as the others left for the fields, Edwin stayed behind. He sat by the cold forge, tracing with his fingers the faint letters carved into its side, letters worn by centuries, but still legible, an A, a cross, and beneath them a small symbol that looked like a river curling into itself. He didn't know whose hand had made it, but when he touched it, the room seemed to still, the air heavy with the scent of rain. He had always felt that the valley was alive, not in the way of stories or ghosts, but in the way the wind turned its head when he spoke softly to it. Sometimes he imagined that the hills listened. Sometimes, when he dreamt, he heard voices, calm, ancient, speaking in a language he could not understand, yet somehow knew by heart. That night he lit the forge alone. The coals breathed back into life, their orange light pulsing like embers of memory. He set a single piece of metal upon the anvil, not for any commission, not for trade, but for himself. As the hammer rose and fell, a steady rhythm filled the hall. The air shimmered with heat and something more, an echo faint but real, as though others had stood beside him in unseen fellowship.
In that moment, he was no longer just a boy. He was every hand that had ever shaped, every heart that had ever endured. He thought of the monk who blessed both gods and soil, of the king who hid in the marsh, of the smith who forged for faith instead of war, of the girl who rebuilt a forgotten forge. He did not know their names, but he felt them, as though time had folded them all into the single heartbeat of metal and fire.
By dawn, the blade was done, small, simple, unadorned. He held it up to the weak light and saw his reflection ripple along its edge. There was no symbol, no crown, no mark of ownership, only balance, only peace. He carried it to the oak that still stood by the river, older now than any man could remember. The bark was rough, its trunk immense, its roots clutching the ground like hands holding memory. Kneeling, Edwin pressed the blade into the soil at its base. "Rest," he whispered. "You have carried us far enough." A breeze stirred, soft and cool. The leaves above him shivered, though there was no wind. And for a brief, trembling instant, the air around him seemed full of figures, men and women, made of light and mist, their faces kind, their eyes knowing. Among them, a king bowed his head, a monk raised his hand in blessing, a woman smiled and turned toward the river. Then they were gone, fading like morning fog into sun. Edwin stayed kneeling for a long while, feeling the damp earth beneath his fingers, the pulse of the roots below. He realized then that the island was not made of stone and soil alone. It was made of memory, layered, patient, eternal. When he returned to the hall, he found a small scrap of parchment pinned to the door. The ink was faint, the handwriting delicate and strange, as if carried from another age. It read, "Every time a hand shapes truth, the land remembers, and those who listen, even in silence, are never forgotten." He tucked the parchment into his coat, unsure who had left it. Perhaps no one. Perhaps everyone. That night, as the mists rolled once more through the valley and the moon hung low over the water, Edwin lay awake, listening to the distant sigh of the forge, cooling to silence. It was a sound as old as prayer, and in that silence, if one were still enough, open enough, there was another sound beneath it. The soft heartbeat of the island, the same that had whispered through Wessex and Winchester, through oak and fire, through centuries of change and stillness alike. If you are awake now, listening through the hush of your own night, feel it too, that quiet rhythm beneath everything. It belongs to no single place, no single time. It is the sound of the world remembering itself, and of you, here, for this brief and gentle moment, remembering with it. For soon another dawn will break, and from its light another keeper will rise.
Dawn crept softly across the valley, its first pale breath brushing the river until the mist began to lift. The forge lay still and empty now, its fire a faint memory of orange beneath the ashes. Edwin stood outside the doorway, his hands rough with work, his heart strangely full. He had not slept. Through the long hours of night he had listened, to the quiet hum beneath the earth, to the distant murmur of wind over the hills. It was not loneliness he felt, but belonging, as though the silence itself had recognized him. In the faint gold of morning, he walked toward the oak once more. Dew clung to the grass, and every step left a shining trace that vanished behind him. The blade he had buried was nowhere to be seen now, only the soft rise of soil, already covered by fallen leaves. He placed his palm upon the bark, rough and cold, and whispered, "I have done what I can." The wind moved through the branches in answer, neither approval nor denial, but something gentler, a wordless acknowledgement. He stayed there until the village began to stir. Smoke rose from chimneys, the clatter of buckets echoed from the well, and somewhere a child laughed,
that bright, brief music that makes the world new each morning. He smiled faintly, thinking how time itself was like that laugh, short, fragile, but endlessly returning. At the forge, he began again. He did not forge swords now, nor tools for trade, but smaller things, a brooch, a cup, a cross to hang in the chapel, each one made with the same care as if it were a crown. People said his work carried something different, though none could name it. Some said his metal shone longer in the light, or that his handles warmed faster in the hand. Edwin only shrugged. Perhaps, he said, the iron remembers. By winter, his fame had spread beyond the valley. Monks from the north came seeking him, asking for bells for their churches. Traders from the south brought silver, salt, and cloth in exchange for his simple craft. But he took little joy in their praise. Each evening he returned to the river to sit beneath the oak and to listen. He said it helped him think, though what he was thinking of he never told. One night when the stars burned sharp and the air held the scent of frost, he heard footsteps on the path. Turning, he saw an old woman approaching, cloaked in blue, her hair white as the moonlight. She walked without haste, her presence calm as falling snow. "You keep late hours, young smith," she said softly. "I listen better when the world sleeps," he replied. She smiled, and for a moment he thought her face looked familiar, though he could not say from where. "That is when truth speaks," she said. "And what does it tell you?"
"That the land is never silent," he answered, "that every flame remembers its spark, and that peace is not the absence of storms, but the willingness to stand through them."
The woman nodded, her gaze drifting toward the river. "Then you have heard well."
When he turned to look again, she was gone. Only a faint shimmer of light hung where she had stood, like breath fading into air.
The next morning he found a single feather lying upon the anvil, long, pale, its edges lined with ash. He kept it above his door, tied with a strand of copper wire, and never spoke of it to anyone. Years flowed quietly after that. The forge continued its song, and the valley lived in peace. Children played where warriors had once stood, and monks sang in languages that now carried both prayer and memory. The oak grew older, its roots threading deeper into the soil, until even the stones nearby seemed to lean toward it for wisdom. When Edwin's own hair turned white, he taught apprentices as his master had once taught him. "Strike gently," he would say. "Metal, like men, remembers kindness more than force." And at the end of every lesson he made them sit in silence to listen to the faint rhythm beneath their feet, the echo of the earth itself breathing. One evening, as he closed the forge for the last time, he looked toward the hills and saw the faint shimmer of light moving through the mist. Not fire, not stars, but something older, familiar. For a moment he thought he saw figures walking, the same pale shapes Cuthred had once glimpsed, the same kind eyes that had watched over the land for generations. They did not speak, they only watched, and then slowly dissolved into the deepening dusk. He felt no fear, only peace. That night he wrote a single line upon a small piece of parchment and left it on his workbench. When his apprentices found it the next morning, it read, "The land does not need to be remembered. It remembers us." They buried him beneath the oak, beside the place where the buried blade once slept. In spring, a circle of white flowers bloomed there, unplanted, untouched. And when the wind passed through the valley, the bells in the monastery chimed softly, though no hands had pulled their ropes. If you are still listening through the soft hush of your own night, let that sound reach you too. That quiet promise carried through time. You, like all who came before, are part of this long remembering. Your breath, your dreams, your moments of stillness. They are the echoes of the same earth that once held Alfred, Edric, Leofric, Aelfwin, and all who shaped this story. Close your eyes now and listen.
The wind beyond your window is not just air. It is the voice of the island, still whispering through centuries, calling gently to every soul that has ever loved, or built, or dreamed. And somewhere beyond the mist, another generation already stirs, a spark waiting to rise, a story yet to be forged in the fire of dawn.
Morning came slow and gold, spreading its light over the valley like a tender hand. The river shimmered beneath the sun, its surface rippling softly against the roots of the old oak. Time had carried away the names of many who once lived here, yet the land, faithful as ever, still remembered. The forge had changed again. New hands tended it now, the apprentices of Edwin's apprentices, children of a gentler age. They no longer forged weapons, nor even tools for toil alone. Instead, they shaped bells for abbeys, chalices for prayer, tiny charms to hang above doorways for luck and peace. Their work had become quiet, reverent, less a craft, more a continuation of something sacred. The youngest among them was a girl named Theda. She was small and slight, with dark hair that always fell loose from its braid, and eyes that seemed to carry two colors at once, one gray like river mist, the other green as moss after rain. She worked with care, and though her hands trembled when she began, the fire seemed to steady them, as though it knew her heart before she did. Theda loved to ask questions. Why did the iron sing when struck just right? Why did the oak still bloom though storms had split its branches? Why did the monk's bells always seem to ring differently when the fog rolled in? Her teacher, a patient man named Osric, would smile and say, "Because everything that lives listens, even the things that do not speak." At night, after the forge cooled, she often wandered to the riverbank. There she would sit, tracing circles in the water with a stick, watching the reflections dance. Sometimes she thought she saw faces beneath the ripples, gentle, watchful, ancient. Once she whispered into the current, "If you remember them all, do you also remember me?" The water gave no answer, but a single leaf floated toward her, golden even in the dark. She took it as one. One winter, when frost hung from the eaves like glass, the monks from Winchester came to the forge. Their abbot, a tall man in plain robes, asked Osric and his apprentices to craft something unlike anything before. "Not a sword, not a bell," he said, "but a vessel for words." They were puzzled. "What kind of vessel?" Theda asked. The abbot smiled faintly. "A chest," he said, "to hold the stories that must not be lost." So they built it, slowly, reverently, a chest of dark oak bound with bands of iron, each hinge carved with small runes that glimmered in the firelight. Theda's hands shaped the clasp, delicate and simple. When it was finished, the abbot ran his palm across the smooth lid and said, "Now it may guard not gold, but memory." The monks carried it back to Winchester, where it was placed in the heart of the library. Inside they laid scrolls, chronicles, prayers, songs of the mead halls, fragments of poems written in the new tongue. One of them was Edric's old line, copied faithfully across generations. "The land remembers what man forgets." Years turned, as years do. Theda grew older, though her spirit never seemed to. The forge became her world, and the rhythm of hammer and fire her meditation. Each time she worked the metal, she felt a pulse, steady, deep, echoing something larger than herself. "It is not I who shape it," she once said softly to Osric, "but the land, through me." When she was near 40, a great storm swept across the valley. The river swelled, the trees bent low, and the winds sang with the voice of 100 memories. She stood at the doorway of the forge, watching lightning flare across the hills, and for a moment she saw the world as it had been. The marshes, the fires, the shapes of men and women long gone. They stood side by side beneath the rain, faces calm, eyes filled with light. The next morning, when the villagers came searching for her, they found the forge unharmed, the fire still burning steady, the tools laid neatly in place. But Theda was gone. Only her apron remained, folded upon the bench, and a small carving beside it, a leaf of iron, shaped so finely it seemed alive. They buried it at the base of the oak. In the seasons that followed, the tree flowered more brightly than it ever had before. Travelers passing through often stopped beneath its shade, saying they felt at peace there, though none could explain why. Some swore they heard faint hammering deep beneath the roots, as if someone below still worked quietly, endlessly, joyfully.
In Winchester, the chest of memory grew heavier with each passing decade. When monks opened it to add new pages, they would sometimes find things they had not placed there. A pressed flower, a feather, once even a thin curl of iron shaped like a leaf. The abbot would smile when he saw such things and say, "It means the world still remembers itself."
And so it did. If you are awake now, listening to these quiet echoes through time, perhaps you feel it too, that invisible thread running through hands and hearts, through hammers and prayers, through roots and rivers. It binds not just the past to the present, but you to all who came before. The night is deep now, but gentle. Let its stillness wrap around you. Listen, truly listen, and you may hear it. The faint hum beneath the silence, the forge of the world still glowing somewhere in the dark. And when you drift into sleep, know this, that every dream you have becomes another ember in that same eternal fire. The land remembers them all. It always will. The centuries kept folding like pages in a slow-turning book. Empires rose beyond the island's edge. Ships crossed seas their ancestors had never dared to name. Yet in the valley where the old oak stood, time moved differently, quieter, deeper. The river still wound past the roots, whispering to itself in the same soft language it had spoken since Alfred's age.
By now the forge had become a small chapel. Its stone walls still bore soot from fires long gone, and in one corner, beneath a narrow window, stood a single anvil polished smooth by countless hands. Pilgrims came not to work, but to sit. They would light a taper, lay a pebble or a coin upon the anvil, and listen to the silence until it began to breathe around them. Among them was a young novice named Rowan. He had come from the north to study at Winchester, but found himself more often here, in this valley that seemed half dream, half memory. He would arrive at dusk, when mist began to gather, and sit beneath the oak with a book open on his knees, though he seldom read. He said the words were already in the air if one was patient enough to hear them. One autumn evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, he noticed a shimmer at the base of the tree, a faint line of light like metal catching its last reflection. Brushing aside the leaves, he found a fragment of iron, thin, curved, and etched with marks he could barely see. He carried it to the chapel and placed it upon the anvil. The firelight touched it, and for a heartbeat, it seemed to glow from within.
That night, Rowan dreamed of the forge alive again, of sparks rising like stars, of hands not his own shaping the molten world. Voices moved through the dream, the monk, the king, the smith, the girl who listened to the river. They spoke not in words, but in warmth, a chorus of remembrance that filled the air with light. When he woke, his eyes were wet, though he could not say why. In the years that followed, he became known for his listening. Where others sought revelation, he sought resonance, the echo between prayer and wind, between human breath and earth's long sigh. He kept the fragment of iron always near, set in a simple frame above his desk. When asked what it was, he would answer, "Proof that nothing is ever lost, only waiting to be heard again." And indeed, the islands seemed to agree. Across the land, ruins were uncovered, old runes deciphered, Songs once nearly forgotten sung again in candlelit halls. Historians wrote of the Anglo Saxons as though unearthing strangers. Poets spoke of them as kin. Every discovery felt less like new knowledge and more like a conversation resumed after centuries of silence. On his last visit to the valley, Rowan was an old man. The chapel was empty, the air sweet with rain. He sat beneath the oak, now vast and hollowed by time, and laid his palm upon the trunk. "You've seen us all," he whispered. "What will you tell those who come after?" The wind rustled through the leaves, and he thought he heard 1,000 answers. Laughter, hammer strikes, the murmur of rivers, the turning of pages, the deep hum of life enduring itself. He smiled, closed his eyes, and rested there until the first light of dawn spilled across his face. When the villagers found him, he was peaceful, his hands still resting against the tree. They buried him beside the chapel beneath a small stone marked only with a rune, the same that had once been carved on the sword of Alfred. In the spring that followed, new saplings grew around his grave, their leaves bright as polished bronze. And so the valley continued to dream. The river still moved, carrying silt and secrets. The oak still whispered when the wind turned east. And beneath its roots, deep where earth and memory entwine, the echoes of every life that had touched it lay folded together, warm and undying. If you are still awake, somewhere beyond this story, feel for that same rhythm beneath your own life. It is the quiet inheritance of every soul that listens. The breath you draw now is the same that once moved through their lungs, the same that stirred their fires, their prayers, their dreams. Let that thought soften you. Let the night settle around you like a cloak. The land is still awake, even as you drift towards sleep. And in your dreaming, it will remember you, just as it remembered them. For the forge still hums beneath the earth, and the mist still waits to rise, carrying the song of all who ever learned to love this island of light and rain. The centuries turned again, and the island entered an age of voices. Bells multiplied, ink darkened on vellum, ships pressed outward toward horizons no monk could have imagined. Yet the heart of the land, the valley, the oak, the river, remained a quiet continent of its own, a small pulse in the great body of time. The chapel still stood, though storms had stripped its roof and moss softened its stones. Travelers still found their way there. Some came by accident, following the glint of the river through the fields. Others came by longing, though they could not name what for. They left offerings as always, a coin, a verse, a hand-carved token, a whispered hope. The anvil remained where it had always been, dim and patient, bearing the dust of centuries like a blessing. One spring evening, a wanderer arrived, a woman cloaked in green, her face lined not with age but with distance. She carried no pack, only a leather-bound journal and a piece of charcoal. She sat beneath the oak, where the roots rose like the ribs of the world and began to draw the curve of the tree, the shadows between its limbs, the faint shimmer of the river beyond. As dusk deepened, she paused, listening. From somewhere far below came a sound, faint but rhythmic, like metal striking metal. She thought it was her imagination, yet the longer she listened, the clearer it became. The echo of a hammer, slow, deliberate, eternal. The wind moved through the grass in time with it, and the leaves trembled as though remembering. When she finally rose, she pressed her palm against the trunk. The bark was cool, and beneath it she felt something, not motion, not sound exactly, but a pulse, a living memory. She whispered without knowing why, "I hear you." That night she slept near the chapel, the stars above her soft and innumerable. She dreamed of the valley as it had been, the smiths, the monks, the kings, the fires, all blurred into one shimmering vision of hands, working, hearts listening,
the world breathing in perfect rhythm. When she awoke, her cheeks were damp with tears she didn't remember shedding. In her journal she wrote,
"The earth dreams through us. We think we are the builders, the tellers, the rememberers, but perhaps it is the land that writes, and we are merely its ink." Before she left, she placed the journal upon the anvil, tied with a strand of her own hair, and whispered a small promise. "Let the next who finds this continue the listening." Then she turned toward the road, her cloak catching the morning light, and was gone. Decades later, when the valley fell under the care of new hands, farmers, shepherds, poets seeking refuge from the noise of growing cities, the journal was found. Its pages were weathered, the words faint, but the writing stirred something in those who read it. Soon, others began to come, not as pilgrims, but as listeners. They came to sit beneath the oak, to walk by the river, to hear what the silence might say. They built no new forge, no walls, no altar. They simply kept the space open, guarded by quiet and time. And there, over many years, poets wrote, painters sketched, and dreamers slept. Some said the valley changed their lives. Others said it changed their sleep. A few spoke of hearing faint music in the air, as though all the old voices had gathered into a single note that never ended. And so the valley endured, not frozen but alive in the stillness, its memory woven into every breath of mist. The oak reached higher, its leaves turned silver at the edges, and each autumn the river carried them away like small boats of light. If you are awake now, lying in your own silence far from that place, know that the rhythm you hear, the hum in the air, the soft weight of night is part of the same song. It passes through all things, through the iron and the root, through the skin and the sky, through the stories we tell and the ones we will never know. So breathe gently. Let your thoughts settle like dust upon the earth. You are listening to something older than language, older than kings, the same quiet fire that once warmed Wessex, that still glows beneath the soil of every field. And as you drift into the half-sleep between now and forever, remember, the land never forgets. It only waits, endlessly patient, for us to remember how to hear. The world had changed its face again. Roads had grown wide and smooth. The sounds of iron wheels and distant bells now threaded the air where once only birds had sung. But the valley, that small cradle of wind and memory, still lay untouched by haste. The river moved at its own pace, brushing against the roots of the oak that had seen 1,000 dawns rise and fall upon its crown. The chapel, half crumbled and half whole, stood like a pause in time. Ivy wrapped its walls, soft as sleep. Inside, dust drifted where candlelight once burned. And upon the anvil, that sacred heart of the place, rested the wanderer's journal, its pages turned pale and tender with age. Travelers still came, drawn not by maps but by a whisper, a feeling that something within the air remembered them before they arrived.
Among those travelers came a young scholar named Elias. He had read of the valley in an obscure footnote, a single line buried in a history of early England, the forge of memory, where the old gods and new once shared the same silence. The words had haunted him for months. So he came, carrying little more than a satchel of books and a restlessness he could not explain.
He arrived near twilight. The sun was low, spilling gold through the trees, and the air smelled faintly of ash and rain. Standing before the oak, Elias felt a weight lift from him, not the burden of his years, but the heaviness of forgetting. It was as if every question he had ever carried had found its answer, though none had been spoken. He entered the chapel, careful not to disturb the quiet. His eyes fell upon the journal, and when he opened it, the scent of old paper filled the room, a dry sweetness like autumn fields. The handwriting was graceful, the ink faded to the color of twilight. He read the line left by the wanderer. The earth dreams through us. And beneath it, faint but still visible, another hand had added years later, and in dreaming, it remembers.
He read until the light failed, then stayed long after darkness fell, sitting by the anvil with the book open on his knees. Outside, the river murmured its endless prayer, and the wind pressed gently against the stone walls as if to listen. At some hour past midnight, Elias thought he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing faintly. He looked up, but the doorway was empty. Only the candle trembled.
Yet the air had changed. It felt alive, dense with presence. And though he saw no one, he felt as if the chapel was suddenly full, filled with those whose hands had shaped, whose hearts had endured. The smiths, the monks, the dreamers, the nameless thousands who had breathed and built and blessed this soil. They were there, unseen but near, their memory woven into the hush.
Elias knelt and whispered, "If this place remembers them, may it also remember me, not for who I am, but for the listening."
When he left at dawn, mist drifted low over the grass. On the anvil he placed his pen, small, simple, made of brass, beside the journal. Another tool for the forge, he murmured, smiling. Years later, those who visited the chapel found that pen blackened but unbroken, fused to the metal by time and weather. It gleamed faintly in the morning light, as though it had caught fire once and refused to let go of its flame. And so the story continued, not told, but kept, breathing quietly beneath the oak's vast shade. The valley, as always, outlasted its keepers. Seasons turned, snow fell and melted. The river carved new curves through the meadow, carrying whispers to faraway shores. Sometimes, children from nearby farms would play by the chapel and swear they heard a faint chiming in the stones, like hammer on iron far beneath the earth. Their mothers smiled and told them it was only the wind. But the children, half dreaming, half certain, would press their ears to the ground, and in that stillness, perhaps they were right. And somewhere within the deep hum of the soil, beneath the roots and the centuries, a steady rhythm endured. It was not the sound of work, nor prayer, nor grief, but of remembrance itself, shaping and reshaping eternity with patient hands. If you are awake tonight, beneath the soft breath of your own dark sky, listen closely. The same hum lives in you, in the quiet between your heartbeats, in the pause between your thoughts. You are part of that unbroken rhythm, a note in the song that began long before language and will never end. So rest now, let the weight of time fall away. The forge still glows beneath the world. The river still carries its stories. The oak still waits in the dawn's first light. And in its shadow, across all ages, the island continues to dream, remembering you as you remember it. By the time another 100 winters had passed, the valley had changed once more, but only on the surface. A narrow road now wound close to its edge, and travelers sometimes glimpsed the glimmer of the river through the hedgerows as they passed, never knowing that they were skirting the oldest memory in the land. The chapel's stones had begun to crumble, yet ivy and wildflowers held them together like loving hands refusing to let go. The oak still stood, vast and solemn, its roots deep in the bones of forgotten kings. The people who lived nearby no longer knew the stories. The names of Alfred, Edric, and Leofric had faded into the fog of centuries, remembered only by scholars who spoke of them as figures carved from legend. But the land itself had not forgotten. It whispered their names in the rain that fell softly over the hills, in the turning of plows, in the rhythm of bells that still rang faintly from the distant abbey when the wind turned just right. One evening, as twilight spread its pale gold through the valley, a young woman came walking down the old path. She was not a pilgrim, nor a scholar, but an artist. Her name was Clara. She carried a sketchbook, a satchel of charcoal, and a heart weary of the noise of cities. She had come to the countryside seeking quiet, though she did not yet know what kind of quiet she was looking for. When she reached the chapel, the air was so still it felt like the world had paused its breathing. The scent of damp earth and moss lingered, and light filtered through the gaps in the roof, breaking upon dust that danced like ancient incense. She set down her satchel, sat cross-legged on the floor, and opened her book.
At first she drew the oak, its branches vast and calm, its shadow long across the grass. Then she began sketching the chapel, the cracked stones, the hollow windows, the old anvil now rusted into the earth. But as she worked, something strange began to happen. Her lines grew softer, less deliberate. Her hand began to move on its own, tracing shapes she had not planned. Faces she did not know, hands raised toward unseen light, the curve of waves, the glint of flame.
When she stopped, she saw that she had filled the page, not with ruins, but with life. The forge burned again. Figures stood in the glow, their expressions gentle and knowing. At the center of it all, a figure bent over the anvil, shaping something unseen, the hammer poised mid-air. She could almost hear the ring of it in the silence. The air around her shifted. The light dimmed, though the sun had not yet set, and for a moment, a single, fleeting breath, she thought she saw them. Shapes in the doorway, pale and luminous, watching her work. They did not speak, but she felt their presence, patient, kind, eternal. A warmth spread through her chest, slow and deep, as though the earth itself had sighed and recognized her. She whispered, "Who are you?" And in the stillness, a voice, not outside her but within, seemed to answer, "We are what you remember when you listen." Tears rose without warning. She closed her book, placed it upon the anvil, and bowed her head. "Then remember me," she said softly, "for I will remember you." The wind stirred, gentle as breath. When she left the chapel that night, the world felt lighter, the hills breathing, the river humming quietly, the stars rising over the oak like embers from a fire that never died. In the years that followed, Clara returned often. She brought others too, poets, painters, musicians, those who had grown tired of a world that moved too fast to feel. They came and sat in silence, drawing or dreaming, sometimes leaving behind a page, a melody, a whispered promise. The chapel became again what it had always been, a forge, but of gentler things, of art, of remembrance. And one day, when the light was especially soft and the air still smelled faintly of smoke and rain, a child among them asked, "Who built this place?" Clara smiled. "No one," she said. "It built itself, out of everything that came before." The child looked thoughtful for a long time, then pressed her ear to the anvil. "It's humming," she said. "Yes," Clara whispered, "it always has." As night fell and the valley sank into its ancient hush, the river gleamed silver, and the oak stood dark against the horizon, keeper of every name, every breath, every forgotten prayer. The mist began to rise once more, curling through the grass like memory returning home. If you are awake beneath your own quiet sky, close your eyes and listen. The hum is still there, beneath the world's noise, beneath your heartbeat, beneath all the distances time has built. The land remembers, and tonight it remembers you too. So breathe and rest and let the dream continue, for the forge beneath the earth still glows, and the story, like the fire, is not yet done. The valley lived on as valleys do, patient, unhurried, watching centuries drift by like petals upon a stream. The roads grew busier, the languages changed, the hands that worked the land became softer, but the soil beneath them still carried the same old warmth. The oak had grown wider still, its hollow trunk deep enough for a child to step inside and listen to the hum that pulsed there, faint, steady, like the heartbeat of something older than the sky. Clara had long since passed, though her sketchbook remained in the chapel, its pages yellowed and curled by years of breath and candlelight. The drawings of faces, of hammers and hands, of flame and mist, they seemed to shimmer faintly when sunlight slipped through the broken roof. The villagers, now keepers by accident rather than choice, called it the book that breathes. Among them was a boy named Thomas. He was 12 when he first found the place, chasing a stray lamb through the fog. The animal darted between the trees, vanishing near the riverbank, and as he searched, he stumbled into the clearing. The air felt different there, heavy but kind, like the pause between two heartbeats. He saw the oak first, then the chapel beyond, half swallowed by ivy. The lamb stood near the doorway, quiet now as if listening. When Thomas stepped inside, he froze. The air was thick with dust and scent, iron, moss, and something faintly sweet, like rain on old parchment. On the anvil lay the sketchbook. Curious, he opened it. The first page showed a woman bending over the forge, her hair like flame. The next, a king kneeling in prayer. Then a monk, a smith, a child holding a single leaf of iron. He didn't know why, but the drawings made his chest tighten. He stayed until the shadows deepened, until the lamb bleated softly and turned toward home. Before leaving, Thomas closed the book and whispered, "I'll come back." And he did. Again and again, through seasons that turned like pages. Each time he came, he sat by the anvil and listened. At first he heard only silence, then, faintly, the sound of something deeper, a low hum like wind beneath stone, like thought before it becomes word. As he grew, so did his understanding. He began to bring things to the chapel, small offerings, a feather, a coin, once even a shard of glass that caught the light like water. For remembering, he'd say quietly, though he didn't know who he spoke to. One autumn afternoon, when the sun was thin and the air full of drifting leaves, an old man arrived at the edge of the field. He watched Thomas from afar, leaning on a staff carved with runes. His eyes were pale but bright, the color of distant rain.
"You listen well," the old man said, stepping closer. "Most people only speak." Thomas startled. "Who are you?"
"Someone who remembers," the man replied, "and soon perhaps so will you." He nodded toward the oak. "That tree has heard more prayers than all the churches in the shire. It does not judge, it only keeps." The old man walked to the anvil, rested his hand upon it, and smiled faintly. "Once, this was a forge. Every blow struck here shaped not just iron, but the soul of a people. Do you feel it still?" Thomas nodded. "It hums."
The man's smile deepened. "Then you are one of its keepers."
He turned to leave, but before he vanished into the mist, he said, "When the world grows too loud, come back to the quiet. It will remember you." Years passed. The valley saw its share of storms and stillness. The river changed course again, carving new banks where reeds whispered to the wind. The chapel weathered and leaned, but never fell, and the oak, patient as time itself, dropped acorns that rooted in its own shadow. Thomas grew to manhood and stayed near the land. He repaired the chapel roof with his own hands, not to restore it, but to preserve its stillness. He told no one of the old man, not because he doubted him, but because some truths survive only in silence. In the evenings, he often sat beneath the oak, watching the sun sink behind the hills. He would close his eyes and breathe in the scent of grass, smoke, and water. And in that breath, he could almost hear them, the voices of all who had come before. Not as ghosts, but as presence, as memory alive.
On the day he died, an old man himself, his hair white and fine as mist, the villagers found him seated by the river, his back against the oak, his face turned toward the light. Beside him, a small object lay upon the grass, a sprig of ivy shaped into a circle, tied with a single strand of copper wire.
When they buried him near the chapel, a soft rain began to fall, though the sky above was clear. The villagers said it was blessing. The wind through the leaves sounded like song. And so the story continued, not ending, not beginning, just flowing onward, quiet as the river that had carried every echo since the first dawn of Wessex. If you are listening now, perhaps from far away, know this. What endures is not the stone, nor the crown, nor even the words. It is the act of remembering, the gentle choice to hear what the world still whispers. So rest easy. Let the centuries wash over you like rain. The same hum that filled that valley hums beneath your own life now, beneath your breathing, beneath your dreams. And as the night deepens, somewhere beyond the hills, the forge glows faintly once more. Its fire eternal, its purpose simple, to keep the world awake in its sleep, remembering all who ever listened. The years that followed were kind, as if time itself had grown weary of struggle and had chosen, at last, to whisper instead of roar. The valley, now veiled in wildflowers and drifting mist, remained a place apart, a hush preserved against the clamor of the world beyond. The oak stood as it always had, gnarled and vast, its bark etched by centuries of wind. Beneath its shadow lay the chapel, half ruin, half dream. The villagers tended to it as one might tend to a grave, gently, without expectation, grateful only that it still stood. Children grew up hearing tales of its hum, and though many laughed, some swore they'd felt the vibration through the soles of their feet when they dared step close on quiet mornings. The elders said it was the heart of the earth itself, still beating softly beneath the forge's long, cold stones. And yet the world beyond the valley never truly left it alone. Scholars came sometimes, carrying cameras and notebooks, their voices too sharp for such a place. They spoke of acoustic anomalies, of subterranean resonance, and geologic vibration patterns. They took samples of soil and stone, recorded the air, and left shaking their heads, no wiser than before. The locals smiled when they went. The land doesn't speak to instruments, one farmer said, only to those who listen. One spring, a young woman named Evelyn came from the city. She was a musician, weary, lost, her mind a tangle of unfinished compositions. Her mother had once told her of the valley, a story passed down through generations, of a forge where sound was prayer and silence was song. "Go there," her mother had said, "when you can't hear yourself anymore." So she came. It was evening when she arrived, the air soft and gold, the light filtering through the trees like memory returning. The oak loomed before her, its branches trembling faintly, though the wind was still. She stood for a long while breathing, before stepping inside the chapel. It was nearly dark. The air smelled of moss and rust and distant rain. She set down her violin case on the floor, knelt beside the anvil, and whispered, "I have nothing left to give, but maybe you can still teach me how to listen." She stayed through the night. At first, she heard only the usual sounds, her breath, the faint ticking of insects, the river murmuring beyond the walls. But then, just as the moon reached its highest point, something changed. The air thickened, the silence deepened, and beneath it, faint as the breath of a dream, came a tone. It was not melody, nor music as she knew it, but a sound older than language. It rose from the stones, from the air itself, from somewhere far below the surface of thought. It filled her bones, her chest, her heartbeat, and then it became her. She lifted her violin, hands trembling, and without thinking, began to play. The notes that came were not hers. They belonged to the valley, to the oak, to the 1,000 lives folded into the earth. The melody drifted through the chapel and out across the fields, soft as light on water. It wove itself through the night, found the river, and followed it down toward the sea. When dawn came, the villagers heard it, faint, distant, like the echo of bells beneath the soil. They followed the sound to the chapel and found Evelyn still there, seated by the anvil, her bow resting loosely in her hand. She smiled when she saw them, her eyes bright as morning. "I didn't play," she said quietly. "I only followed." In the days that followed, she stayed in the valley. She repaired the roof of the chapel, cleared ivy from the stones, and each evening she played again, not for applause, not for purpose, but for peace. Travelers who passed at twilight often stopped upon the ridge, hearing her music floating through the mist. Some wept, though they could not say why.
Over time, others came, artists, poets, wanderers, drawn not by fame but by something deeper. Together they built a small wooden door for the chapel, carved with an image of the oak and the river entwined. Above it they inscribed the words that had lived there since the beginning. The land remembers what man forgets.
Evelyn grew old there. When she died, they buried her beneath the roots of the oak, her violin laid across her chest. The villagers said that when the wind passed through its branches, you could still hear her song, faint, eternal, like breath upon glass. And so the valley endured, a sanctuary not of faith or nation, but of memory itself. If you are listening now, somewhere far from that place, know that the sound she followed still moves through the world, through the rustle of leaves outside your window, through the pulse beneath your ribs, through the hush that lingers just before sleep. Close your eyes and perhaps you will hear it too, the song that never ends, the hum of everything that ever was and will be. It is not calling you to remember, it is reminding you that you already do. The centuries, as ever, turned again. Wars raged elsewhere, cities rose in glass and steel. The air itself grew crowded with the voices of machines. But the valley endured, quiet as prayer. It was never marked on the bright new maps. It existed between coordinates, a breathing memory folded into the landscape, known only to those who found it by accident or perhaps by need. The oak still ruled the clearing, though it was older now than the cathedrals that had outlived empires. Its trunk had hollowed with time, but its heartwood still pulsed with life. Birds nested in its boughs, foxes slept in the cradle of its roots. The river, unchanged in its path, kept up its slow conversation with the earth. And the chapel, half ruin, half grace, leaned softly into age, its stones bound by moss and silence. Those who came in the new age were not pilgrims or peasants, but seekers of another kind. Historians, photographers, people who had lost their faith in sound and light, but not yet in meaning. They came burdened by the speed of their world, and left lighter, as though time itself had slowed to breathe beside them. Some said the valley hummed differently now, not like iron struck by hammer, but like a heartbeat magnified by distance. One of those seekers was a young man named Jonas. He was a sound engineer, a listener by trade, though his ears had grown tired of cities. One autumn, after the death of his father, he wandered without plan, following the roads that curved toward the coast. It was there, somewhere between exhaustion and accident, that he found the valley.
It greeted him with quiet. The kind of quiet that was not absence but presence, layered, watchful, alive. He walked to the chapel and placed his recorder upon the anvil. Then, sitting cross-legged on the floor, he whispered, "Let me hear you."
For an hour there was nothing, only wind, only breath. But then, something began, a sound below sound, a vibration so low he felt it in his ribs more than in his ears. He turned up the gain, the dials trembled. The machine captured what his body already knew, a tone so deep and soft it seemed to come not from the air, but from the heart of the earth. He left the recorder running all night. In the morning, when he played it back, the sound was still there, constant, endless, shaped like warmth. And beneath it, Barely audible, something else, the faintest pattern, like footsteps fading into fog. For weeks he stayed, returning each evening with new equipment, though he began to realize the microphones were irrelevant. What mattered was the listening. The valley did not want to be recorded, it wanted to be understood. One night, as mist rolled from the river and the oak's branches trembled against the stars, Jonas dreamt of firelight. He saw the old smiths at their work, the monks copying by candle, the kings kneeling, the women forging small miracles in silence. He saw Evelyn playing her violin, her bow drawn slow as breath. They were not ghosts, they were echoes, carried forward like sound itself, never vanishing, only transforming. When he awoke, his eyes were wet, and the recorder beside him was still running. The morning light glowed through the broken roof, and for a moment he swore he heard the hum not outside but within, as if the valley had followed him into his heartbeat. He went home eventually, back to the noise and the lights, but he carried the valley with him. On restless nights, when sleep refused to come, he would play that recording, the low, endless hum, and the world would soften around him. He never released it publicly. Some sounds, he said, are not meant for sharing, only for remembering. Years later, after his death, his daughter found the file on an old hard drive. It was simply named For Listening. When she played it, her speakers trembled softly, and she felt the same stillness her father had described, the sense that the sound was alive, that it was watching her as much as she was hearing it. She left the recording playing as she fell asleep, and in her dream she stood beneath the oak. The night was bright with stars, and the air carried a faint music, not melody, but memory, woven through the mist. She looked down and saw her father beside her, smiling. "Can you hear it?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered, "it's everything." And the sounds swelled, ocean and wind, forge and fire, the laughter of children, the sigh of ages, all folding into one long note that stretched across time. If you are awake now, somewhere between this world and the next, perhaps you hear it too. The same hum that once moved through the iron and the oak, through Evelyn's bow and Alfred's prayer, through the hearts of all who have ever paused long enough to listen. Do not seek to name it, just breathe with it. It has been waiting for you as it waits for everyone, patient, eternal, remembering. The night is deep now. Let its quiet fill you like water filling a cup. The forge still glows beneath the earth. The river still carries the sound toward dawn. And somewhere, far beneath the noise of this world, the valley still hums, the island's heart still dreaming us into being. Time, like mist, continued to drift, shapeless, tireless, kind. Centuries loosened their grip, and the world above grew stranger. Towers of light reaching into the night sky. Oceans crossed not by oar or sail, but by invisible waves of sound. Yet beneath all this brilliance and clamor, the old rhythm endured. The hum that had begun with hammer and heart still breathed quietly, somewhere beneath the noise of progress. The valley, though smaller now on the maps, remained whole. The oak still stood, older than memory, its great limbs sheltering the bones of the chapel that had become more air than stone. Moss crowned its roots, and the river, though shifted by time, still ran beside it, soft, silver, unending. Few visited anymore. A handful of wanderers found their way there each decade, drawn not by knowledge, but by need. Among them came a girl named Isla. She had grown up in a world of constant noise, screens that sang, cities that never slept, a hum not born of earth but of electricity. She carried in her ears the exhaustion of too much hearing and not enough listening. After losing someone she loved, a father who had once worked with sound, she followed an old file she found on his computer. Its name was simple, For Listening. The recording was faint, almost empty, a low vibration, soft as breath, but it did something no music had ever done. It quieted her. When she closed her eyes, she could almost feel a wind that was not there,
could almost see a valley she had never known.
So she followed it. Weeks later, she arrived in the countryside where maps gave up their detail, walking until the air itself seemed to change, until the world grew slower, gentler, older. When she reached the valley, it was near dusk. The oak rose before her, vast against the dying light, its trunk hollowed but still living. Beneath it lay the chapel's remains, a scatter of stones embraced by ivy. She sat among them, pulled out a small recorder, sleek, modern, alive with tiny blinking lights, and pressed record. The valley gave nothing back at first, only wind, only the sigh of grass. But as darkness deepened, she felt it, faint, low, patient. The same hum her father had once captured, now returning home. She closed her eyes. The air thickened, not with sound, but with presence. The earth beneath her knees seemed to breathe. She heard the strike of distant metal, the rustle of robes, the rhythm of steps through marsh and fog. Voices rose, not words, but warmth. The hum became a choir, 1,000 generations folding into one tone, rising like dawn through the soil. Her tears fell silently. She whispered, "I hear you."
And then she began to hum back.
At first uncertain, trembling, human, but soon her note found the valleys, and for one impossible heartbeat, they were the same. The ground trembled, not violently, but tenderly, like something waking after a long sleep. A light flickered within the hollow of the oak, faint as ember, soft as soul. When the dawn came, Isla was gone. Her recorder lay in the grass, still blinking. The villagers found it days later and carried it to the nearest town, curious about the faint warmth it still held. They played the file and heard, not silence, not wind, not voice, but harmony. The valley had sung.
It was quiet, endless, wordless, like breath shared between worlds.
Scholars studied it, artists wept, scientists argued, but none could say where the sound began or ended. They called it the English tone, though no machine could explain its origin. Some said it was the echo of an underground river. Others swore it was human, a note older than memory, carried forward by the land itself. Years later, in a classroom filled with young musicians, a teacher played that sound. The children fell still. "What is it?" one asked. The teacher smiled faintly. "It's the earth," she said. Remembering. Outside, through windows glazed with rain, the same wind that had once moved through the marshes brushed against the glass. Somewhere far away, perhaps beneath that very soil, the hum continued, unchanged, unbroken, infinite.
And in the quiet spaces of the night, those who still listened could feel it. The same deep pulse beneath their ribs, the same memory beneath thought.
If you are hearing it now, wherever you are, let it hold you. The sound is not reaching for you. It has always been within you. It is the rhythm of all who ever lived, all who ever dreamed, all who ever waited in the hush between heartbeats.
So breathe slowly.
The land remembers you. It hums with your breath. And the story, still warm beneath the ash of time, turns toward its final dawn.
The dawn came quietly, almost shyly, a slow unfurling of gold across the mist-veiled hills. The valley glowed as if lit from within, its grass heavy with dew, its river whispering with a language only the earth still spoke. The oak stood steady, its leaves trembling with light, and the air carried that familiar hum, softer now but no less alive.
No one truly knew when the sound had begun, nor who had first listened. But by now, it had traveled farther than any voice, across air and water, through iron and memory, through the breath of each generation that had paused long enough to feel the world beating beneath them. Time, as always, had moved on. Cities had risen beyond the valley. their towers of glass catching the same sunlight that once fell on Alfred's marshes. Yet even there, amid the pulse of electricity, the hum of machines, and the music of new ages, some still heard it. The old tone, the ancient song, the echo of a forge that had never truly cooled. The valley was quiet now. Grass covered the stones of the chapel. The river wound closer to the oak, its waters silver and slow. The place no longer drew visitors as it once had. Maps called it private land, though no fences marked its borders. Still, sometimes, on calm evenings, a figure would appear by the tree, a farmer resting after work, a traveler lost on an old road, a child chasing something only she could see. Each would pause, just for a moment, and listen. And in that stillness something always stirred, faint but certain, like a heartbeat answering another. Deep beneath the roots, beneath the iron and the bones and the years, the forge still glowed. Its fire was not of flame, but of remembrance, a warmth that asked for nothing and gave everything. The hum rose and fell with the river's breath, weaving itself through the soil, through the oak, through the sky. It was not history now. It was simply being. And perhaps that is what it had always been trying to tell them, that the land had never belonged to kings or borders, nor to faith or name. It had only ever belonged to memory, to every life that had touched it, to every word spoken into its wind. On some nights, when the stars were clear and the air was still, the valley seemed to shimmer faintly, as if the centuries themselves were visible, the monks with their ink-stained fingers, the smiths shaping light, the queen of song beneath her oak, the child who pressed her ear to the ground. They were all there, folded into the hum, breathing as one. And when morning came, it was gentle. The mist lifted, the hum softened, the forge, unseen, eternal, exhaled once, then fell silent. Not in ending, but in rest. The valley slept. The river carried its whisper toward the sea, and above it all the oak, patient keeper of the ages, stood in silence, its branches full of birds, its shadow stretching over the graves of time. If you are still awake beneath your own ceiling of stars, listen once more before sleep takes you. The sound is there if you are quiet enough, the breath beneath your breath, the memory beneath your heartbeat. For every story ends this way, not with forgetting, but with return. The island remembers you. The earth keeps your name. And somewhere, beyond the horizon of dream, the forge still glows, waiting for you to find it again. So close your eyes. Rest now, traveler. You have walked through centuries. Let the land hold you one last time, for you are part of its song, and it, forever, is part of you.